The lamps hum faintly in the hospital ward, their glow dimmed by cigarette haze and antiseptic air. Every surface smells of alcohol and new beginnings. Nurses move like ghosts through the corridor, white shoes whispering across the tile. Somewhere, a radio murmurs promises of modern miracles, pills that soothe pain, calm nerves, and make motherhood easier. On the bedside table, a small white tablet gleams like purity itself. Its name is thalidomide. It was meant to be progress in a pill, a wonder of chemistry for the restless, the expectant, the sleepless. Mothers were told it was safe, safer than aspirin, even. They took it with tea, with trust, with the quiet belief that science had finally made compassion mechanical. And for a while, it worked. The world sighed in relief. But then came the cries. Infants born without arms, without legs, with faces that couldn't breathe, or eyes that couldn't open. Maternity wards fell silent. Doctors avoided one another's gaze. Each malformed birth was dismissed as chance until chance became pattern, and pattern became plague. If you're listening now, hold your breath, because this isn't just the story of a drug gone wrong. It's the story of faith. Faith in medicine, in progress, in the bright lie of safety, and how it turned to ash in a single generation. Today, we return to the mid-century glow that hid the world's darkest experiment, the pill of thalidomide, from wonder drug to global disaster. The war had left the world hollow, but from the rubble came a strange kind of light. It glowed in laboratories, in the hum of new machines, in the clean white of hospital corridors that smelled of bleach and rebirth. In the early years of the 1950s, progress was not a word, it was a prayer. Doctors spoke it softly, like a promise that all suffering could one day be measured, dosed, and cured. Europe was rebuilding its body, and West Germany, in particular, wanted to wash its hands clean of the past. Factories that once forged weapons now made medicine. Scientists in pressed coats replaced soldiers in uniform, their tools gentler but their ambitions no smaller. The air buzzed with invention, plastic for limbs, radiation for healing, chemistry for comfort. Mothers whispered hope again, and fathers trusted the future. To doubt science was to doubt salvation. In this world of optimism, illness no longer seemed inevitable. It seemed optional. Pills appeared for everything: anxiety, sleeplessness, nausea, nerves. Each new tablet felt like an act of mercy, promising a kind of peace that no prayer or tonic had ever delivered. The pharmacy became a church of glass bottles and measured grams. Even the advertisements were hymns to modern life. Soft voices, white gowns, bright smiles, no shadows. In Stolberg, a small industrial town in West Germany, a pharmaceutical company named Chemie Grünenthal worked day and night to create one of these miracles. The scientists, they were not dreamers but believers, men who thought chemistry could redeem humanity. One of them, a quiet chemist with wire-rimmed glasses, studied a compound first developed during the war as a sedative. It was harmless. He thought so mild it couldn't even kill a rat. That harmlessness was its magic. At least, that's what they told themselves. The pill induced calm without coma, sleep without risk. Mice did not die, rabbits barely reacted. It was, by all appearances, the perfect drug. They called it thalidomide. Soon, bottles began to appear on pharmacy shelves, labeled in elegant script, wrapped in the language of safety. Completely non-toxic, one brochure read. So gentle it can be given to children. The chemists smiled, the salesman toasted, and the company celebrated. A tranquilizer for the modern world who could resist. In homes from Dusseldorf to Hamburg, the first prescriptions were written. The tablets were small and white, easy to swallow, with a faintly sweet aftertaste. Housewives took them for sleeplessness, for restlessness, for the tension that never seemed to leave their shoulders. And then came the pregnant women, reassured that thalidomide was not just harmless, but helpful, easing the nausea that haunted their mornings. Doctors nodded, confident. The science was sound. The era of worry was over. Outside, snow fell softly against the windows of the chemists' laboratories, covering the roofs of a country desperate to believe in its own goodness again. No one noticed the irony that the same discipline which had once built destruction was now building comfort, and that both were born from the same desire: control. In the sterile light of post-war Europe, the pill gleamed like redemption. No one could see, not yet, what shadows it carried beneath that perfect white surface. The glow of the new age had begun, and it would burn brighter than anyone could bear. It began, as most discoveries do, not with brilliance, but with boredom. In a small corner of Chemie Grunenthal's laboratory, a young chemist named Heinrich Muchter watched a pale solution swirl in a beaker under the harsh hum of fluorescent light. Outside, the snow turned the streets of Stolberg to glass, muffling the clatter of the rebuilt world. Inside, time felt suspended, just the soft clink of glass, the smell of solvents, and the rhythm of hope. Muchter had been a military scientist during the war. His hands had once mixed substances for survival and warfare alike, and though the uniforms had changed, the mission had not. Germany wanted redemption, and science would deliver it. His dream was simple: a sedative so safe that even an overdose could not harm. He wanted to create a drug that could quiet not only the mind, but the guilt that still lingered in his country's veins. In the post-war years, the race for a perfect tranquilizer became almost spiritual. Barbiturates, the popular sedatives of the time, had already shown their cruelty. They calmed the body, yes, but at the cost of breath, of life. A few extra tablets could turn sleep into death. Muchter's colleagues whispered of patients who never woke, of mothers found beside empty bottles and half-written notes. To find a gentler cure was more than science, it was penance. The experiments were routine, even dull. Hundreds of chemical derivatives were mixed, heated, cooled, catalogued. Most were forgotten within hours, but one compound lingered. It had an unusual structure: stable, unreactive, deceptively calm. When tested on animals, it caused no tremors, no vomiting, no convulsions. The mice slept, woke, and carried on as though nothing had happened. It was perfect. Muchter's notes, still smudged with the ghosts of lab ink, described the moment clinically. Compound 6,215. Well tolerated. Non-toxic. Ideal for further development. But beneath the clinical words lay something more: pride, relief, and the quiet thrill of a man who believed he had found grace through science. In the following weeks, the company's testing room became a temple of optimism. Young assistants noted results with trembling hands. Executives visited the lab, smiling in approval. A sedative without risk, they said. This will change everything. No one asked the questions that would later seem obvious. No one looked beyond the cage, or wondered how a drug so inert in animals might behave inside a forming human life. Thalidomide was born not from malice, but from omission, from a silence dressed as certainty. It was tested, but never truly understood. In the rush to rebuild a nation and restore faith in chemistry, skepticism felt unpatriotic. Every experiment confirmed what everyone wanted to believe. By late 1954, the first vials were sent for human trials, small doses given to volunteers who described the experience as peaceful, even blissful. No hangover, no addiction, no fear. Sleep fell upon them like forgiveness. When Muchter left the lab that winter night, he paused beneath the snow, his breath visible in the cold air. Behind him, the windows of the factory glowed with pale light, as if the future itself were being distilled in glass. He believed he had created something pure, something that would heal, not harm, and in that quiet certainty, the dream solidified. A white tablet to end all suffering, a chemist's redemption, a nation's pride. No one could yet see the shape of the tragedy forming in the cradle of his creation. The pill's journey had only just begun, and like all dreams, it would soon become a nightmare. It looked harmless, a small round pill the color of snow, smooth as porcelain. with no scent, no warning, no taste of danger. It sat in glass bottles under the soft hum of fluorescent light, waiting to be born into the world. Workers at the Chemie Grunenthal factory packed it by the thousands, gloved hands moving with machine-like precision. Each tablet gleamed like purity itself, a symbol of peace for a tired generation that had survived war but not yet escaped fear. They named it Contagon. The word rolled gently off the tongue, promising calmness, sleep, and relief. The advertisements would soon call it the modern sedative safe for all ages. Housewives were told it would ease the strain of long days and longer nights. Businessmen could take it before bed to silence the endless hum of worry. And for expectant mothers, doctors whispered, it was a blessing, a way to quiet the nausea of early pregnancy without endangering the child. That assurance was everything. After all, the science said it was harmless. The company's own studies had shown no toxicity, no risk, no reason to fear. No one noticed that those studies were missing something crucial: a single test on a pregnant animal. In those years, fetal safety was a concept barely spoken. Doctors believed the womb was sacred, sealed from the outside world. What the mother took, they thought, the baby would never feel. In the laboratories of Stolberg, the pills were tested again and again on rabbits, rats, dogs, and men. None of them died. The chemists celebrated with cautious pride. A sedative that couldn't kill was a marvel in itself. Executives toasted champagne in the boardroom. They had found the perfect product for a market desperate for comfort and security. By 1957, the first shipments began to leave Germany. Boxes labeled Contagon were stacked onto trucks bound for pharmacies across Europe. Soon, the same tablets would appear under different names in different countries: Distaval in Britain, Sofenon in Italy, Tensival in South America. The white pill crossed borders faster than any warning ever could. Doctors prescribed it without hesitation. Mothers took it without fear. The world wanted sleep, and thalidomide delivered it. In the glossy pages of magazines, smiling women in crisp aprons held their babies and praised the miracle of modern medicine. One advertisement read, "For calm nights and brighter mornings, Contagon brings peace to mother and child." The image was perfection itself. Sunlight pouring through white curtains, a baby's hand resting against a mother's cheek. No one saw the quiet irony that within a few short years, those same hands would be missing. Back in the factories, the workers continued to press the pills, watching them roll down steel chutes like snowflakes. The air was warm with the smell of talc and alcohol, the sound of whirring machines steady as a heartbeat. No one there thought of what they were, making as dangerous they thought of it as progress. In a world that had seen enough of pain, the white tablet promised peace, and for a time it delivered exactly that, the softest sleep imaginable. No one yet knew that the same tablet, that same symbol of modern mercy, would soon take more from humanity than any war before it. What began as a cure for restlessness was quietly becoming a seed of catastrophe, small enough to fit on a fingertip, powerful enough to scar generations. The white tablet gleamed under the factory lights, perfect and pure, as if innocence could be pressed into form. In truth, it was already something else entirely, the calm before the storm. By the late 1950s, the name thalidomide had begun to hum through Europe like a lullaby. It appeared in elegant type on posters, on pharmacy windows, on the glossy pages of women's magazines beside smiling faces and bright kitchens. The advertisements promised safety wrapped in modernity, the kind of security that post-war families craved more than anything. A pill without risk, they said. A sedative, gentle enough for children, even for expectant mothers. Chemie Grunenthal's marketing department knew the power of tone. They didn't sell medicine, they sold comfort. Their slogans were soothing, the colors soft. Thalidomide means tranquility. Sleep naturally, wake refreshed. Doctors received boxes of sample tablets with handwritten notes, thanking them for bringing peace to the home. Sales representatives in pressed suits carried portfolios full of glowing testimonials and smiling endorsements. Each success story added to the illusion that progress itself could be swallowed with water. In London, the British distributor Distillers Company, better known for whiskey than for pharmaceuticals, took note of the German miracle. They bought the rights and released the same white pill under a new name, Distaval. The rebranding was deliberate. It sounded clean, balanced, and trustworthy, the very image of British decency. Within a year, the pill was everywhere. On the shelves of Boots chemists, in the handbags of nurses, beside teacups on nightstands. The timing was perfect. The world was restless, caught between atomic fear and suburban comfort. Housewives sought relief from nerves. Workers longed for quiet sleep after long shifts. Doctors, weary from treating anxiety with dangerous barbiturates, saw thalidomide as salvation. It didn't dull the senses or slow the pulse. It didn't cause hangovers or dependency. It simply softened the edges of modern life, or so it seemed. The drug's creators had chosen its name with care, thalidomide. Smooth, clinical, and strangely serene, like the sound of breath slowing before sleep. It felt harmless even to say it. The very name seemed to reassure the world that chemistry had learned restraint, that medicine could now offer peace without penalty. But names can lie. Behind that calm syllable hid a molecule with a dark geometry, stable in structure, deceptive in behavior. In warm light, it healed. In shadow, it destroyed. Unknown to its makers, thalidomide existed as two mirror images of itself. Twin molecules, identical in composition, but opposite in effect. One soothed, the other shattered, and inside every pill, both were waiting. No one in Stolberg or London or Sydney knew this yet. To them, thalidomide was perfection, made visible, the fulfillment of every post-war promise. The company's brochures showed young mothers strolling through gardens, free from nausea and worry, their babies kicking gently beneath white linen dresses. The image of safety was irresistible, and doctors, too, fell under its charm. By 1959, thalidomide was being prescribed in 46 countries under nearly 70 different brand names. It crossed languages and borders with the ease of a whispered prayer. Wherever it went, it carried the same assurance, safe, gentle, proven. And so the world swallowed it whole. On the surface, nothing changed. Sleep came easily, nausea faded, mornings felt clear. The world exhaled in gratitude. But beneath that serene silence, something had already begun to stir. The molecule that bore the name of calm was quietly rewriting the code of human life, twisting it into shapes that no language yet had words for. The name thalidomide meant calm, yes, but in the years to come, it would come to mean something else entirely. The sound of a cradle stilled. The decade of the 1950s had promised that motherhood would finally become easy. The advertisements said so. In magazines and radio jingles, women were told that science had conquered discomfort, that technology had tamed the body. Morning sickness, once a private misery endured in silence, could now be dissolved in a glass of water with a single small pill. The world had entered the age of painless pregnancy, or so it believed. In the kitchens of Cologne, London, and Melbourne, women opened tiny boxes labeled Contagon, Distaval, Soften. The tablets inside were white and smooth, soft on the tongue, the taste faintly sweet. Doctors had assured them that this was no dangerous barbiturate, no experimental tonic, but the safest remedy ever made, harmless to mother and child, entirely non-toxic. It was even said that thalidomide was so gentle, one could swallow an entire bottle without risk. And so women did what mothers always do when faced with suffering they trusted. Trust was the invisible thread running through the post-war world. Governments told their citizens to trust science. Doctors told their patients to trust progress. Husbands told their wives to trust the modern age. And after the exhaustion of 2 world wars, women were ready to believe. They wanted to live in a world where everything, even childbirth, could be clean, clinical, and controlled. In maternity clinics, midwives praised the new drug's elegance. Gone were the days of dangerous injections and bitter tinctures. Now, A soft pill promised to soothe both nerves and nausea. A civilized solution for a civilized world. Pharmacists handed it across counters with smiles, wrapped in crisp paper, as though passing on a blessing. Mothers placed the tablets carefully beside their prenatal vitamins, unaware that each dose carried the power to rewrite the fate of their unborn child. The first signs were subtle, too small to notice, too scattered to suspect. A few mothers complained of tingling in their hands or feet, strange numbness that came and went. Doctors dismissed it as tension, exhaustion, or the normal strain of pregnancy. After all, thalidomide was safe. The company's leaflets said so, the medical journals said so, even the government licenses said so. The reassurance was repeated so often, it became its own truth. In those months, across thousands of quiet bedrooms, women took the tablets faithfully before bed, after breakfast, whenever the nausea returned. Some husbands watched proudly, believing they were witnessing the dawn of a new age in which suffering could finally be erased by science. Others hardly noticed at all. The pills were small and the habit soon became routine. No one could see what was happening beneath the surface, how the same compound that calmed a woman's stomach was crossing the fragile barrier to the child inside her. No one imagined that something so simple, so pure, could twist the formation of limbs, ears, hearts. The womb, once thought untouchable, had been breached. By the time the first mothers began to feel the flutter of life within them, it was already too late. The damage was done, silent and irreversible, written into the architecture of their children's bodies. Yet in those early months, the world still looked bright. Pregnant women smiled in advertisements, their bellies round with promise, their hands resting on the future. The mothers of the new era were radiant and unknowingly doomed to carry the proof that progress could be deadly. In their search for comfort, they had placed their faith in a pill that would one day redefine the meaning of tragedy. And as they swallowed their trust each morning, none could know that the next generation, their own, would be born bearing the cost of their belief. By the spring of 1958, the little white pill had found its way into nearly every medicine cabinet in Europe. Its reach was extraordinary. Mothers, students, factory workers, even children. If you were anxious, sleepless, nauseated, or simply weary of the world, thalidomide was the answer. The advertisements said it all. For rest, for calm, for life in balance, doctors prescribed it for more than pregnancy. They gave it to businessmen who couldn't sleep after long hours at the office, to soldiers haunted by memories of the front, to housewives exhausted by the monotony of post-war routine. Chemie Grunenthal's representatives called it the people's sedative, a miracle of modern chemistry that could soothe every mind without dulling it. There was no overdose risk, they said, no addiction, no danger. The perfect drug for an imperfect world. Pharmacies began stocking it beside the toothpaste and aspirin. No prescription required. In some countries, it could, to even be bought by mail. A neat little box, promising serenity delivered to your doorstep. Its popularity soared. The pills became symbols of control, a way to manage the body and the mind in an age when both were expected to behave flawlessly. In hospitals, physicians began using thalidomide to steady patients after surgery. It was given to the elderly for tremors, to the young for exam stress, to the restless for sleepless nights. The line between treatment and indulgence blurred. People took it simply because they could, because it was modern, scientific, safe. The world was learning to medicate not only pain, but discomfort itself. And yet, in the quiet between doses, small warnings began to flicker. A nurse in Hamburg noted that some patients complained of numb fingers and tingling toes. A pharmacist in Vienna recorded several cases of faint dizziness and muscle weakness. The company dismissed it all as trivial. Every medicine, they said, carried side effects. The symptoms were temporary, a small price to pay for peace of mind. Behind the polished walls of Chemie Grunenthal, the executives gathered for meetings thick with cigarette smoke and optimism. Reports of success poured in from distributors across Europe. Sales had doubled, then tripled. They spoke of expanding into Africa, South America, Asia. In Britain, Distillers Company Limited rebranded thalidomide once more, this time as Distaval Forte, stronger, faster, better. The more the world wanted calm, the more the company provided it. In the laboratories, however, there were quiet doubts. A few researchers whispered that something about the drug felt unpredictable. Its chemistry too complex, its behavior too unstudied. The animal tests, they realized, had been shallow, focused only on survival, not development. But in a culture drunk on progress, hesitation was heresy. The scientists silenced their unease, buried it under graphs and glowing reports. By late 1959, thalidomide had become more than a drug. It was an emblem of the new age, the idea that every problem, physical or emotional, could be solved by swallowing something small and white. Each tablet carried the weight of a promise, that the chaos of human life could finally be tamed. But chemistry does not obey faith. It moves in silence, indifferent to dreams, changing what it touches in ways too small to see until it's too late. And so, as the decade turned and the world slept soundly under its chemical comfort, the first invisible fractures had already begun to spread through bloodstreams, through wombs, through generations yet unborn. It was said to be the softest sleep imaginable. One pill before bed, and the world would dissolve into a slow, velvet quiet. No dizziness, no morning fog, no lingering bitterness on the tongue. Just peace. The kind that felt earned after years of worry, after nights haunted by the echoes of bombs, the guilt of survival, the noise of rebuilding. For those who had lived through the war, thalidomide was not merely a sedative, it was a promise that the nightmares had finally ended. Across Europe, it became ritual. Housewives placed a small glass of water beside their bed, the tablet gleaming faintly in the lamplight like a pearl. Some took it after dinner, others just before sleep, waiting for that familiar wave of calm to slide gently through the body. Within minutes, muscles softened, thoughts slowed, breath deepened. The pill did what it said it would. It granted surrender. In hospital wards, nurses learned to recognize the thalidomide quiet. Patients drifted into rest without struggle, as though the medicine didn't suppress the mind but simply persuaded it to let go. It became the drug of kindness, one that didn't punish you for needing it. Doctors admired its elegance. Even at high doses, there was no danger, no addiction, no fatal mistake. You can't hurt yourself with thalidomide, they said. It's perfectly safe. The illusion of safety became its own lullaby. Soon, families began sharing it. A husband took one for a restless night. A mother offered half a pill to her teenage daughter before an exam. Elderly parents used it to quiet aching nerves. Thalidomide blurred the lines between treatment and comfort, between necessity and indulgence. It made surrender seem modern, scientific, even moral. By the end of 1959, the company's executives boasted that thalidomide could be taken by everyone from child to grandmother. Advertisements depicted scenes of domestic perfection, mothers resting beside cradles, men waking to cheerful mornings, children smiling under golden sunlight. Nowhere in the images was there fear. The pill's whiteness was symbolic, pure, sterile, benevolent. It represented everything post-war Europe longed to believe about itself. And for a while, it delivered exactly that. The gentle sleep spread like a quiet contagion. Pharmacies sold out. Chemie Grunenthal could hardly keep up with demand. In Britain alone, Distillers' supply chain ran 24 hours a day. At night, the glow from factory windows painted the sky a steady orange, the hum of production unbroken. Each bottle shipped was another dream sold to a world desperate for silence. But sleep is not peace. Beneath the stillness of thalidomide's promise, something unseen had begun to stir small changes, imperceptible, inside the bodies of pregnant women who took it in faith. The pill that quieted the mind also stilled the cells of forming life. Limbs that should have stretched and curled began to shorten, nerves misfired, hearts faltered. None of this was known, of course, not yet. To the world, thalidomide was still the gentle sleep, the pill that had no cruelty in it, the medicine that mothers could take without fear. They swallowed it as they kissed their children goodnight, unaware that it was quietly rewriting the future growing inside them. And in those calm, dreamless hours, as whole cities slept under its spell, history itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first cries that would never come. By the turn of the decade, thalidomide had conquered the world, a white flag planted in every household and hospital. To the public, it seemed the perfect medicine, mild, modern, merciful, but behind that immaculate image lay a truth so simple it was almost absurd no one had ever tested it on a pregnant animal. It was not neglect born of malice, but of arrogance. In the 1950s, medicine still worshipped the adult body. The womb was considered a sanctuary, sealed off from harm. Scientists believed that whatever passed through a mother's blood could not reach her child, that the placenta was an unbreachable wall between two worlds. No one thought to question this, and so when the company's toxicology team ran its experiments, they chose the standard subjects: rats, rabbits, dogs. They measured sleep, appetite, reflexes, heart rate, all normal, all safe. They declared it harmless because nothing had died. But safety is not only the absence of death. The tests had never asked the right questions about cell growth, fetal formation, neurological development. They were built to look for poison, not distortion, and so the most devastating side effects of thalidomide remained invisible, written in the smallest, quietest places: the folds of DNA, the flicker of dividing cells, the architecture of a growing limb. Inside Chemie Grunenthal's laboratories, a few researchers raised quiet doubts. The drug behaved oddly under certain conditions, dissolving differently in warm versus cool blood, affecting each test animal unpredictably. One assistant noted that the company had skipped the long-term trials entirely, rushing to market before the paperwork was complete. But their voices were soft, their concerns brushed aside. The executives wanted results, not hesitation. "The drug is perfectly safe," Mukta said in a meeting. "Safer than anything on the market. Our data is sound." And it was, at least on paper. Elsewhere, in Britain, the distillers' company performed its own trials, brief, perfunctory, focused on adults. No one there thought to test for pregnancy either. After all, the Germans had done that work, hadn't they? It was a chain of misplaced trust, each link reinforcing the illusion of safety. The result was a global echo of negligence, laboratories copying one another's mistakes until they became doctrine. The first hints of trouble appeared as whispers. A few doctors wrote to Grunenthal about patients reporting strange numbness, a burning sensation in their hands and feet. The company labeled it mild neuropathy, reversible upon discontinuation. They dismissed it as fatigue, poor circulation, or the price of modern living. But behind those small symptoms, something monstrous was gathering damage far deeper than nerves. If even one scientist had thought to test thalidomide on a pregnant rabbit, the disaster might have stopped before it began. But in the glow of post-war optimism, no one imagined that science itself could betray. Laboratories had become temples of certainty, chemists the new priests. And so the tests ended where they began, at the surface. They proved the drug did not kill. They never asked if it could deform. By the time anyone realized what had been forgotten, the mistake had already multiplied across continents, carried in the bloodstreams of thousands of mothers who trusted the calmness in a bottle. The laboratories slept soundly, unaware that their silence had given birth to a generation of nightmares. The first signs came quietly, hidden in the hush of maternity wards. It was late 1959 when the whispers began, a strange pattern of births in the colder months, when women who had taken thalidomide through the nausea of early pregnancy were finally giving birth. At first, the nurses didn't understand what they were seeing. The mothers labored, cried, and pushed as they always had. But when the babies arrived, a chill fell over the room. Some were missing arms, the shoulders smooth and rounded, as if the limbs had never existed. Others had legs that ended in flippers, or feet turned backward. Some had hands like tiny paddles, fingers fused together as though sculpted in haste. Many had ears that were only folds of skin, or eyes that blinked but never focused, and some far too many did not breathe at all. Doctors looked away as midwives wrapped the newborns in blankets. Mothers, exhausted from pain and sedation, reached out for their babies and were met with silence. The infants were rushed from the room, the door closing softly behind the nurse. In the corridors, a quiet panic began to spread. No one could explain it. These were not normal birth defects. They were too sudden, too uniform, too unnatural. In the hospitals of Hamburg and Hanover, of Leeds and Birmingham, the patterns repeated. A few physicians began keeping private notes, unwilling to believe coincidence. They recorded the dates of conception, the mother's diets, their exposure to chemicals, their medications. Again and again, one name appeared: Contagion. Yet even as the evidence gathered, the official response was disbelief. Congenital malformations, the experts said, had always existed. Nature made mistakes. And in any case, how could a pill so mild, so thoroughly tested, be the cause? The pharmaceutical company dismissed the claims as hysteria. They sent representatives to hospitals bearing flowers and reassurances, promising that Contagion was as safe as bread. But among the nurses, the truth was already spreading. They were the ones who held the babies, who saw the shapes that no one wanted to describe. They whispered to one another in break rooms, their tea gone cold. "Something's wrong," they said. "It's the medicine." By the winter of 1960, entire wards had turned solemn. The sound of newborn cries seemed to vanish, replaced by the rustle of paper birth records, defect reports, photographs locked in drawers. Some doctors began asking discreetly if their colleagues had seen the same. Most nodded, grimly. And yet, still, no one spoke publicly. To accuse a drug company was to accuse science itself, and few were willing to risk their reputations on whispers and horror. Meanwhile, the mothers tried to make sense of what had happened. They had done everything right, eaten well, rested, followed every instruction. They had trusted their doctors, and when they asked, "Why is my baby like this?" the answers came wrapped in pity and lies. A rare condition, they were told. Bad luck, nothing you could have done. Outside, the world went on as usual. The snow fell on rooftops, on pharmacy signs, on the trucks that carried new shipments of thalidomide through sleeping cities. No one could see that beneath the frost, an invisible epidemic was already unfolding, thousands of lives quietly altered before their first breath. The children of winter had arrived, and with them, the beginning of the reckoning. By the spring of 1960, the pattern had grown too clear to dismiss. Hospitals across Europe were quietly filling with infants, whose bodies seemed shaped by a cruel new logic. The medical charts could barely describe what they recorded. "Severe limb reduction," one physician wrote. "Amelia." Another note simply read, "Phocomelia, limbs like seals." The word came from the Greek phoc, meaning seal, a desperate attempt to give language to something unspeakable. Yet the more doctors named it, the more helpless they felt. In wards from Dusseldorf to Dublin, from Stockholm to Sydney, the same scenes repeated. Babies born with no arms but hands sprouting directly from shoulders, legs fused or absent, spines twisted, eyes clouded, ears missing, hearts malformed. Some survived only hours, others days. A few, astonishingly, clung to life. Their cries, thin, high, bewildered, echoed through hospital halls where silence had once ruled. Nurses learned to carry the newborns carefully, avoiding mirrors. The mothers were rarely told the truth. In those days, few dared to photograph them. The cameras were too heavy, the flash too cruel. Still, some doctors documented what they saw in private files. Grainy, black and white images of tiny bodies, alien and familiar all at once. The pictures were meant for study, but they carried the weight of confession. Each one, a record of faith, betrayed the faith in science, in medicine, in progress itself. Kemi Grunenthal's offices, meanwhile, were awash in letters. reports from doctors, midwives, even priests, each one describing a tragedy that mirrored another. The company's response was swift and sterile. No proven connection between contagion and congenital defects. They published reassurance pamphlets, doubled their advertising, and blamed malnutrition, infection, radiation, anything but the pill. Their silence was corporate armor, polished, impenetrable, and deadly. The few physicians who questioned the drug's safety found themselves isolated. One German pediatrician, Dr. Widukind Lenz, noticed an explosion of phocomelia cases in his Hamburg clinic, more in 1 year than he had seen in his entire career. His gut told him the cause was environmental, man-made. He began interviewing the mothers himself, his notes growing darker with every conversation. Almost all had taken Contagan during pregnancy. He compiled the evidence carefully, page by page, until the truth became undeniable, even to him. Across the world, in Australia, a young obstetrician named William McBride was seeing the same thing. He too noticed babies with missing limbs, their mothers bewildered, their histories eerily similar. He too traced the trail back to a single name, thalidomide, but while doctors wrestled with data and doubt, the public knew nothing. Newspapers ran stories about strange deformities without mentioning a cause. The company maintained its spotless image, insisting that rumors only caused panic. And so, thalidomide remained on shelves. Pharmacies kept selling, doctors kept prescribing, pregnant women kept swallowing. In homes across Europe, mothers rocked their infants in darkened rooms, whispering prayers to gods they no longer trusted. They didn't know that thousands of others were doing the same, that their sorrow was not solitary, but shared. By the end of that year, the children had become uncountable. Hospitals stopped naming them in press reports. Their conditions became statistics, their mothers anonymous. They were the unnamed malformations born from a pill that promised safety, buried under a silence that would not last forever. And somewhere, in the sterile offices of Grunenthal, a quiet unease began to stir. The numbers no longer looked like coincidence. They looked like consequence. It began in the quiet corners of hospitals, where truths are always spoken first. The nurses, who saw everything and said little, were the ones who understood before anyone else. They were the hands that received the newborns, the arms that carried them away when the room fell silent, the eyes that met those of mothers still too dazed to realize what had gone wrong. They were the ones who noticed, not the executives, not the chemists, not the men in white coats who spoke in data and denial. The nurses whispered in the break rooms, over cold tea and sleepless shifts. "Another one today?" one said softly, staring into her cup. "No arms, just little hands at the shoulders." Another nodded, and the one before that, her legs ended at the knees. They exchanged glances, heavy with exhaustion and dread. They had seen too much to believe in coincidence. In maternity wards across Europe, the same whispers spread like a slow contagion. In Hamburg, Leeds, Stockholm, Milan, it didn't matter the language. The tone was always the same. Disbelief, shading into fear. A midwife in Cologne wrote in her notebook, "The mothers all took the same tablets. For morning sickness, white and round." She underlined the words twice, as if to make them real. At first, they told themselves it must be something in the water, or the air, or fate itself. But the pattern grew too precise, too cruelly consistent. The babies born without arms were almost always full-term, otherwise healthy. Their mothers had all been diligent, no drinking, no smoking, no neglect. They had done everything right, everything the doctors told them, and that was the part that made it unbearable. In the nurses' dormitories, they began keeping quiet lists, names, dates, birth defects, medications. Some hid the lists in their lockers, others passed them discreetly to sympathetic doctors. But few dared to speak openly. Hospitals depended on the pharmaceutical companies that supplied them. Questioning a popular drug was unthinkable. Nurses who raised concerns were told they were being emotional. "You're not a scientist," one supervisor scolded. "You don't understand the data." Yet the nurses did understand something, not science perhaps, but life and its fragility. They knew what normal newborns looked like, how they felt in the arms, the way their tiny fingers curled instinctively around a thumb. And they knew that what they were seeing now was not normal. The shape of the baby's limbs, the slackness of their joints, the way their eyes seemed to stare without focus, these things haunted them long after their shifts ended. Some tried to comfort the mothers, whispering gentle lies. "He's still beautiful. She's strong. Medicine will help." But the words rang hollow. The mothers sensed the truth in the nurses' faces, in the way they hesitated before handing over the wrapped bundle, in the way they avoided saying the word healthy. By 1960, the whispers had become a low hum through the hallways of hospitals and clinics. The nurses could no longer ignore it, even if no one else would listen. In the stillness of the night shifts, when the wards fell quiet, and the only sounds were the ticking of clocks and the faint cries of newborns, they felt the weight of something enormous pressing against them, a catastrophe still invisible to the world outside. They didn't yet know its name, but they knew it had one. And that name, though whispered at first between them like a secret, would soon echo across continents. Thalidomide. The pharmacies smelled of disinfectant and quiet confidence. Behind the polished counters stood men in white coats who believed, as everyone did, in the purity of modern medicine. The shelves gleamed with bottles labeled Contagan, Distaval, Soften, each box a symbol of progress, a promise sealed in foil. To the pharmacists, thalidomide was not a danger but a success story. It had passed every test that mattered, carried the blessing of doctors, and made their customers grateful. And in a post-war world still haunted by pain, gratitude was a valuable thing. When the first letters arrived, handwritten notes from local physicians, describing infants born with missing limbs, the pharmacists frowned but didn't panic. There were always anomalies, they told themselves. A rare condition, perhaps hereditary. They had heard such things before. They placed the letters in drawers, beside invoices and product brochures, and carried on with their day. After all, the company had assured them of the drug's safety, and the company was science itself. The sales representatives came often, charming and immaculately dressed, bringing samples and pamphlets printed with pastel-colored smiles. Completely safe, they repeated like a hymn. Suitable for mothers, even children. Their briefcases gleamed like confessionals. They spoke of how thalidomide was revolutionizing modern care, how it had conquered insomnia and nausea without the dangers of older drugs. To doubt them would be to doubt progress itself. But the rumors grew louder. Midwives whispered in waiting rooms. Doctors began to request fewer bottles. And still, the pharmacists resisted. They were men of order, trained to believe in data, not superstition. If thalidomide were truly dangerous, they reasoned, there would be an official recall, a statement, a warning, something. No such thing came. The silence from Chemie Grunenthal was absolute, as thick as the glass that lined their storefronts. One pharmacist in Dusseldorf finally wrote back to the company. His note was cautious, polite. Several physicians report unusual birth outcomes among patients using Contagan. Might this be worth investigation? The reply came within days, crisp and formal. There is no scientific evidence to support these claims. Please continue to assure your customers that Contagan is completely safe for use. The letter was signed by a medical liaison with the company's seal, a golden emblem of authority. That was enough. The pharmacist placed the correspondence in a file and closed the matter. Outside, the shelves remained full, the customers steady. Pregnant women smiled as they accepted their boxes, grateful to be part of the modern age. In Britain, the Distillers Company issued similar assurances. Their circulars to pharmacists dismissed the German rumors as regrettable misinformation. In Australia, distributors cited European success as proof of safety. The drug kept moving from warehouse to counter, from counter to hand, from hand to womb. Each transaction carried the same quiet faith. If it were dangerous, surely someone would have stopped it. But no one stopped it. Not yet. The pharmacists who prided themselves on precision, on dosage, on purity, on knowledge, had become unwitting couriers of catastrophe. Behind every smile, behind every reassurance, another child was being formed without limbs, without eyes, without a chance. And still the counters shone, the receipts printed, the pills dispensed. The pharmacists, like everyone else, believed the illusion. They were not liars, only believers who mistook silence for truth. In their denial, polished and professional, the epidemic continued to grow, one small white tablet at a time. In the grey chill of a Hamburg morning, Dr. Widukind Lenz sat alone at his desk, staring at a stack of case files that refused to make sense. Each folder carried the same story told in different handwriting: healthy mothers, normal pregnancies, and infants born with bodies that defied nature, limbs ending in buds, hands sprouting where elbows should be, eyes misaligned, hearts malformed. The pattern was undeniable, yet the cause invisible. He had seen coincidences before, but this was no coincidence. This was a design gone wrong. Lenz was not a man given to hysteria, a pediatrician by training, a scientist by discipline. He believed in data, in proof, but as the months passed and the number of affected children rose, proof became unnecessary. The evidence was everywhere. Breathing weakly in cradles and hospital wards, he began charting them on a map of Hamburg, drawing pins for each case. The city soon glittered with sorrow, a constellation of small tragedies radiating outward from a single, terrible center. He started visiting the mothers himself, sitting at their kitchen tables, listening as they described their pregnancies. He asked what they had eaten, where they had worked, what illnesses they had endured. Almost all told him the same thing, that in the early weeks of nausea and sleeplessness, their doctors had prescribed a new sedative. They said its name hesitantly, as if it were a secret: Contagon. Lenz felt the floor shift beneath him. The pill was everywhere, recommended for everything, sold even without prescription. He had seen the advertisements: radiant mothers, perfect infants, the promises of safety. Now he saw those same promises twisted into the small, frail bodies in his ward. He began keeping a detailed ledger. Dates, dosages, deformities. The evidence grew impossible to ignore. When he took his findings to his colleagues, they frowned. Some were sympathetic but cautious. Others waved him off. "You're making connections that don't exist," one said. "Birth defects happen. Always have." The pharmaceutical representatives who visited the hospitals were more direct. "Doctor, you risk creating unnecessary panic. There is no proof." But Lenz's conscience had already turned restless. He knew what he was seeing, and he could not unsee it. He wrote directly to Chemie Grunenthal, detailing the cases, the timing, the correlation. The company replied with rehearsed politeness, thanking him for his concern, but assuring him that Contagon had been tested exhaustively. Their tone was firm, almost paternal. The drug was safe. The rumors, they said, were damaging science. Lenz read the letter twice and folded it carefully into his pocket. He understood then that he would have to act alone. He began contacting physicians across Germany, asking if they had seen similar malformations. Slowly, cautiously, replies came back: yes, in Frankfurt; yes, in Cologne; yes, in Munich. The pattern was national, international, even. By the autumn of 1961, Lenz was no longer whispering. He was shouting. He presented his findings at a pediatric conference in Düsseldorf, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he laid the photographs on the table. Rows of doctors leaned forward, faces blanching. Silence filled the room, not skepticism, but realization. The drug that had promised safety had done this. Within weeks, the first hospitals began removing Contagon from their shelves, but in pharmacies and homes, it remained. The company still denied everything. Outside, the leaves were falling, and mothers were still taking their nightly tablets, unaware that their children's fates were already sealed. Lenz, exhausted, walked home through the cold streets knowing he had crossed an invisible line from medicine to rebellion, from healer to accuser. And though history would remember him as the man who stopped thalidomide, in that moment he was simply a doctor who could no longer stay quiet while science lied. Half a world away from Hamburg, in the quiet wards of Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney, another doctor was beginning to see what Lenz had already uncovered. His name was Dr. William McBride, a young obstetrician with sharp eyes, a careful manner, and a reputation for diligence. The maternity ward was his world, the cries of newborns, the rhythmic squeak of nurses' shoes, the scent of antiseptic and warm linen. It was a place of beginnings, but in the winter of 1960, something began to trouble him. At first, it was a single baby born without arms, its tiny hands emerging from its shoulders like buds. The mother's pregnancy had been ordinary. No infections, no accidents, no known complications. Then came another, and another, each case different, but all bound by the same unnatural signature: limbs shortened, malformed, or missing entirely. McBride's colleagues offered explanations: malnutrition, genetics, random chance. But McBride's instinct told him otherwise. He began to notice that these mothers too shared a strange similarity. All had been prescribed a new drug for morning sickness. The name was thalidomide. It sounded benign, almost gentle, the kind of word that belonged on a bottle of lotion rather than a prescription pad. It had been imported to Australia only a few years earlier by the pharmaceutical firm Distillers, who marketed it under various names: Distaval, Tensival, Valgis. Its slogan appeared everywhere: safe for mother and child. The company boasted that it was so mild it could be taken like candy. And that, McBride realized, was exactly what people were doing. He began keeping notes, just as Lenz had done in Germany. Each file was methodical, detached, almost clinical in tone, but between the lines, horror bled through. The dates of conception matched the period of thalidomide use. The timing of the deformities aligned perfectly with the drug's interference in early pregnancy. It was not random. It was systematic. At night, McBride sat alone at his desk, the sound of the ceiling fan the only movement in the still air. He turned over the photographs, the case notes, the evidence no one else wanted to see. He thought of the mothers, young women who had done nothing wrong, who had followed their doctor's advice and now carried the weight of unspeakable grief. Some had already lost their babies. Others clung to them with a kind of reverent sorrow, unwilling to let go, even as their tiny hearts failed. By late 1961, McBride could no longer keep silent. He wrote to Distillers, warning them of what he had found. The reply was cool, almost dismissive. There is no evidence that thalidomide causes deformities. The drug remains safe for use. It was the same line repeated across continents, written by executives who had never set foot in a delivery room. So, McBride did what few dared. He went public. On December 16, 1961, his letter was published in The Lancet, one of the world's most respected medical journals. It was short, clinical, and devastatingly clear. Congenital abnormalities have been observed in infants whose mothers were given thalidomide in early pregnancy. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within weeks, the drug was withdrawn from sale in Australia. Newspapers splashed his name across their front pages. Mothers who had taken the drug flooded clinics, desperate for reassurance that could no longer be given. But even as McBride's revelation spread, it arrived too late for thousands. The pill had already crossed oceans, slipped through borders, and nested in medicine cabinets around the world. The damage was done. Still, his courage rippled outward, reaching the desks of regulators, journalists, and lawmakers who could no longer claim ignorance. The silence was finally cracking. In Germany, Dr. Lenz's warnings had begun to move the government. In Australia, McBride's voice gave them, wait. Two doctors, oceans apart, had spoken the same truth, and for the first time, the world was listening. But what they didn't yet know was how deep the silence went, nor how many lives still lay hidden beneath it. In the final weeks of 1961, as the northern sky pressed low over Germany, a single letter left the pediatric department of Hamburg University Hospital. It was written on thin paper, typed carefully by Dr. Widukind Lenz, and addressed to the Ministry of Health in Bonn. The letter was not emotional, not accusatory, only precise, factual, and heavy with what it implied. It described a correlation between a popular sedative, Contagon, and the sudden, unprecedented wave of infant deformities sweeping the nation. The tone was calm, almost deceptively so, but beneath the measured sentences lay urgency, a quiet desperation only a doctor could feel when watching preventable suffering unfold in real time. Lenz had already spoken at medical conferences, warning colleagues about the link, but words spoken in rooms full of white coats were easily ignored. Paper, however, could not be unheard. Once written, it lingered. He included photographs, charts, case summaries, the face one, evidence that no official could comfortably overlook. He described babies born without limbs, others with organs twisted beyond repair, and mothers whose only shared trait was their use of a single drug. The timing of ingestion aligned precisely with the first trimester of pregnancy, the critical window of fetal development. He concluded with a line that would later become famous for its restraint and its gravity: the possibility of a connection between Contagon and the recent rise in congenital malformations should be investigated immediately. The letter reached Bonn on a cold December morning. Civil servants read it with discomfort, passing it from desk to desk, each unwilling to be the one to sign their name beneath such a warning. The ministry contacted Chemie Grünenthal for clarification. The company's reply came quickly, confident, dismissive, and dripping with polished authority. Dr. Lenz's claims are scientifically unfounded, they wrote. Contagon has undergone extensive testing. It is completely harmless. There is no cause for public concern. They doubled their advertising the following week. Posters still hung in pharmacies declaring Contagon the safest sedative in the world. Sales representatives were instructed to assure doctors that rumors of side effects were being exaggerated by competitors. The company feared panic more than truth. But outside the boardrooms, the panic was already real, not among investors, but among mothers. Lenz's findings began to circulate quietly among pediatricians and midwives. In the wards, nurses spoke his name like a secret blessing, as if naming him might slow the tide of deformed births. For the first time, the medical community felt the ground shifting beneath its confidence. Then, on November 27, 1961, Lenz made his findings public on national television. His voice was calm, almost weary, as he explained the connection between Contagon and the birth defects. The broadcast lasted only minutes, but its impact rippled through every household in Germany. By morning, Chemie Grünenthal was besieged with phone calls. Pharmacies began pulling boxes from shelves. Mothers demanded to know if the tablets they had taken could harm their unborn children. Within days, the company announced the temporary suspension of Contagon sales, a euphemism for retreat. By then, the damage was irreversible. Nearly 3 million tablets remained in circulation. Thousands of women were still pregnant, their children's fates already sealed. The letter from Hamburg had done what years of silence could not. It had forced the truth into daylight, but Lenz took no satisfaction from it. He spent those weeks moving from hospital to hospital, comforting families, documenting new cases, and watching the enormity of the catastrophe unfold. When he finally stopped one night to rest, the city outside his window was silent, the kind of silence that follows disaster, when everyone finally realizes what they've lost, but not yet how much. The letter had reached its destination, but the reckoning it began was only just starting. The truth was out-whispered by doctors, printed in cautious newspapers, murmured in hallways thick with disbelief. And yet, in the weeks that followed the warnings from Hamburg and Sydney, the world hesitated. Bureaucrats stalled, companies denied, and governments terrified of panic softened their words until the meaning almost disappeared. The phrase "possible connection" became a shield behind which the guilty could hide. In Germany, the withdrawal of Contagon was announced quietly, almost apologetically, as though the decision were one of courtesy rather than necessity. No one at Chemie Grünenthal admitted fault. They spoke of isolated cases, of ongoing research, of public misunderstanding. Not once did they say disaster. To do so would have shattered the illusion that science was still in control. The press, too, walked carefully. Editors feared libel suits from the pharmaceutical giants. Some newspapers published the facts only as small notices, buried between advertisements for soap and cigarettes. The sedative Contagon has been temporarily suspended, pending investigation. Others omitted the name entirely, referring only to a certain popular medicine. The result was confusion. Mothers did not know which pill was being condemned, and many continued to take thalidomide under its countless brand names. Beyond Germany, the silence was worse. In Britain, the Distillers Company dismissed McBride's findings as inconclusive. In Italy, the drug remained available under the name Soften for months after the recall. In Japan, in Canada, in South America, shipments still moved through ports like ghosts of a catastrophe denied. The letters from doctors in those countries would come later, too late, describing the same birth defects, the same bewildered mothers, the same pattern that should have stopped the world in its tracks. But the world was not ready to listen. It had built its faith too completely on the promise of progress. The pharmaceutical industry was untouchable, a symbol of human triumph over suffering. To question its integrity felt like questioning the century itself. Even regulators were hesitant, aware that condemning one company might shake confidence in all the rest. In boardrooms and ministries, meetings stretched late into the night. Men in suits spoke of reputation, of economic stability, of avoiding hysteria. Some argued that it was better to wait for conclusive proof before making any public statement. Others simply hoped the scandal would fade on its own. Meanwhile, in maternity wards, proof was being born every day, crying, gasping, and sometimes not crying at all. Letters poured into newspapers and medical journals. "My baby has no arms," one woman wrote. "I took Contagon for only 2 weeks." Another wrote, "I trusted my doctor. What do I tell my child?" Many of these letters were never published. Editors found them too painful, too inflammatory, too dangerous. The collective denial became a second tragedy. Even as evidence piled up, the machinery of authority moved with unbearable slowness, weighted by pride and fear. For every meeting, another child was born malformed. For every memo marked confidential, another mother was told her grief was coincidence. By the time the first official investigations began in early 1962, thalidomide had already written its story into the flesh of thousands. The world that had once celebrated progress was now confronted by its cost, and still, it tried not to look. When Dr. Lenz walked through the streets of Hamburg that winter, he saw posters for the latest miracle cures still pasted to pharmacy windows. Bright colors, smiling faces, promises of safety, the same words that had betrayed them all. The world had been given the truth, but it wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. The silence, though cracked, still held thin, trembling, but unbroken. For a little while longer, snow fell softly over Germany that December of 1961, blanketing the roofs and market squares in deceptive peace. The cities glowed with Christmas lights, shop windows dressed in gold, tinsel, and the kind of cheer that post-war Europe clung to like faith. But behind the warmth of candles and the scent of pine, a different kind of stillness was spreading, a silence that lived inside hospitals, behind closed nursery doors, and in the homes where mothers dared not decorate at all. The newspapers still carried advertisements for thalidomide under its foreign trade names. Pharmacies in Italy, Japan, and South America continued to sell it as if nothing had happened. Boxes of tablets sat beneath Christmas trees, wrapped neatly with ribbons, gifts from husbands who wanted their pregnant wives to feel better through the holidays. They didn't know. No one had told them. The company had withdrawn the drug in Germany, but the recall had not been global. The warnings had not crossed oceans. In maternity wards from Dusseldorf to Dublin, from Stockholm to Sydney, the deliveries continued. The doctors, now alert to what was happening, could only watch helplessly as new cases appeared every week. There were no words left for the mothers, no comfort would suffice. Each cry that echoed through the corridors felt like both a beginning and an ending, the start of a life already marked by suffering. The nurses had stopped whispering. Their silence was heavier now, ritualistic. When a child was born deformed, they moved quickly, gently, as though performing a sacred duty. They wrapped the infant in cloth and carried it away before the mother could see too much. Some hospitals told the women that their babies had not survived, even when they had. Mercy, they said. It was easier that way. In Hamburg, Dr. Lenz spent Christmas night walking the dim corridors of his ward, past rows of incubators glowing faintly in the dark. Many of the children were barely clinging to life, their lungs too weak, their hearts too fragile. He paused at one, a girl with no arms but wide, unblinking eyes. She stared up at him, her small chest rising with shallow breaths. Her mother, sitting beside the crib, looked at him with a kind of calm beyond despair. "I only wanted to help her," she whispered. "The doctor said it would make me sleep." Lenz had no answer. Meanwhile, in Australia, Dr. William McBride faced a similar Christmas. Letters from across the country reached his desk, mothers pleading for information, for absolution, for a reason. He couldn't give it. He knew only that their grief connected them to thousands of others they would never meet. The world was stitched together now by invisible threads of tragedy. That holiday season was meant to mark recovery 15 years after the war. Europe had rebuilt, economies were thriving, and modern medicine had promised safety at last. Instead, hospitals were filled with cribs that no one dared to look into for long. Outside, the bells rang as they always had, carrying hymns through the cold night air. But inside, among the mothers who no longer sang, another kind of song was taking form. The low, steady hum of anger, guilt, and awakening. It would be years before the courts began, decades before the apologies, but the real reckoning started that Christmas, the Christmas of shadows, when joy and horror shared the same rooftops, and every falling snowflake seemed to bury one more secret beneath it. For the first time, humanity began to glimpse the cost of its faith in chemistry, and though the world did not yet know it, the children born that winter, the children of thalidomide, would carry the memory of that silence for the rest of their lives. On the morning of November 27, 1961, Chemie Grünenthal finally made the announcement it had resisted for months. The company issued a brief press release, just a few sentences long, printed in small type and distributed to newspapers and radio stations. In light of recent reports of possible side effects, the manufacture and sale of Contergan will be discontinued as a precautionary measure. There was no admission of fault, no acknowledgement of tragedy. The statement was couched in the familiar language of caution, not confession. But for those who had been pleading for action, it was the first crack in the fortress of denial. The withdrawal came too late. By the time the company acted, more than 100,000 people had taken the drug in West Germany alone. Millions more tablets had been exported, renamed, and resold across nearly 50 countries. Shipments were still sitting in warehouses, pharmacies, and home cabinets. In many nations, no warning followed. The drug was still being prescribed under its other trade names: Distaval, Softenin, Isomin, Tensival. The global machine moved slower than truth could travel. In the company's headquarters at Stolberg, the executives moved quickly to control the damage. They gathered the press into a conference room that smelled of polish and tension. A spokesman read prepared remarks. There is as yet no definitive proof of any connection between Contergan and these alleged birth defects. Behind the words lay a strategy to withdraw quietly, to protect investors, and to weather the storm until it passed. But the storm had already become a flood. Doctors began returning unused stock in silence, their faces drawn with guilt. Some destroyed their supplies outright, refusing to risk another life. Others hesitated, waiting for official confirmation, unwilling to believe they had unknowingly harmed their patients. Pharmacies placed small notices in their windows. Product, temporarily unavailable. No explanation, no apology. In homes across Germany, mothers searched their medicine cabinets, finding the half-empty boxes with pastel labels. Some threw them away immediately, others kept them as evidence, as a reminder, as something to hold when their grief was too heavy to speak. Many were pregnant still, counting days, waiting for birth with a dread they could not name. Dr. Lenz continued his rounds, gathering new data even as the world tried to move on. He knew the withdrawal would not stop the births already set in motion. The damage, he told his colleagues, was a wave still rolling toward us. He was right. The following year, hundreds more infants would be born with the same unmistakable deformities, their mothers having taken thalidomide months before the recall. Chemie Grünenthal's withdrawal was followed, hesitantly, by others. In December, distillers finally pulled Distaval from the British market. In January, the United States issued warnings against its importation. But for every nation that acted, another delayed. The drug's many aliases kept it alive in the black markets and in the homes of those who could not bear to believe they had been deceived. By spring of 1962, thalidomide had vanished from pharmacy shelves, but not from the bloodstream of history. The world's faith in modern medicine had been shaken, yet few grasped the true scale of what had happened. Governments treated it as a local mistake, a tragic misfortune, not yet as a global failure. For the victims, however, there was no such illusion. The withdrawal may have closed the factories, but it could not withdraw what had already been born. The small white tablets were gone, but their shadow lingered in hospital cribs, in silent nurseries, in the hearts of mothers who could never again trust the miracle they had once been promised. The drug had been withdrawn, yes, but the wound it left behind was permanent, and it would take decades for the world to realize that the recall had not ended the tragedy. It had only begun the reckoning. In the months after thalidomide's withdrawal, hospitals became archives of sorrow. Every city, every region, every country began its own accounting, not of profits or sales, but of loss. The task was immense and almost unbearable. How do you count the cost of a promise broken? How do you number the children who never lived, or the ones who lived only to suffer? At first, the reports trickled in, hesitant and incomplete. Local clinics sent handwritten notes to ministries of health, tallying cases of congenital malformation, possibly associated with contagion. But the numbers refused to stay small. Each new letter added a handful more: 5 infants in Cologne, 12 in Düsseldorf, 8 in Munich. Doctors in London reported 20. By the time the data reached Bonn, it was no longer possible to dismiss. The figures had begun to climb into the thousands. Germany alone counted more than 5,000 known victims. Britain confirmed 2,000 more. The final global estimate would never be exact, but historians later agreed that at least 10,000 babies were born with severe deformities, and tens of thousands more perished in the womb, stillborn, unrecorded, erased before they could be counted. The hidden deaths, as one midwife called them, were the numbers no one dared to write down. Public health officials, unprepared for the scale, fumbled through bureaucracy. Committees were formed, investigations launched, reports commissioned. Every statistic became an act of mourning disguised as administration. Governments published cautious statements expressing sympathy for affected families, but the language was sterile, as if grief could be quantified on paper. Approximately, estimated, probable, words that distanced the living from the dead. The doctors who had prescribed the drug carried their own private ledgers of guilt. Some broke down and left medicine entirely. Others devoted the rest of their careers to pediatric care, as if redemption might still be possible. In one hospital, a physician wrote in his journal, "I know the number of children I have harmed. It is carved into me." Meanwhile, the survivors, the infants who lived, became case studies. Their names turned into medical entries: Phocomelia, Amelia, Syndactyly. They were measured, photographed, and described in clinical terms. For the parents, this cold precision was almost another cruelty. To the world, these children were statistics. To their families, they were miracles that had arrived broken. Journalists began to demand answers. Some called the tragedy the Hiroshima of medicine. Others published photographs of the children, forcing the public to confront what had been hidden behind scientific jargon. For the first time, the horror had a face, and it was small and human and impossible to ignore. But even as the truth spread, many governments sought to limit the count. To count too honestly was to expose too deeply. Compensation required clarity, and clarity meant blame. The numbers were political now. Kemi Grunenthal's lawyers argued that the media was exaggerating, that the doctors' records were unreliable, that the correlation did not equal causation. It was a language designed to dilute responsibility. Yet the count continued, unstoppable, carried by the persistence of mothers who refused to let their children be erased. They wrote to newspapers, gathered in church halls, compared stories, dates, prescriptions. The more they spoke, the more the illusion of accident crumbled. By the end of 1962, there was no denying it. Thalidomide had become the most catastrophic drug disaster in modern history. The count was still incomplete, but the pattern was unmistakable. Thousands of children across continents, all bearing the same marks, all born from the same promise of safety. And as the final numbers rose into the tens of thousands, the world began to understand that it wasn't merely counting victims, it was counting faith itself. The faith that science, unchecked and unquestioned, would always heal, never harm. That faith had shattered, and no arithmetic could measure the loss. By the start of 1962, the world's newsrooms were buzzing with fragments of a story too vast and too terrible to contain. Editors shuffled telegrams across desks, medical reports slipped under doors, and whispers from doctors' conferences drifted through corridors. And yet, when the newspapers went to print, the front pages remained curiously quiet. Headlines about politics and the Cold War drowned out the faint, desperate murmur of a tragedy still seeking its name. The problem wasn't the absence of facts, it was the fear of them. Kemi Grunenthal, the German company at the center of the storm, had lawyers stationed in every major city. Letters stamped confidential arrived daily at editorial offices, reminding publishers that libel laws were unforgiving. Any accusation linking Contagun to the wave of infant deformities, they warned, would bring severe legal consequences. Few editors were willing to risk it. The newspapers needed advertisers, and the pharmaceutical industry paid well for its full-page spreads of smiling mothers and soft slogans about health. The few who tried to speak met immediate pressure. In Dusseldorf, a local paper ran a short article quoting Dr. Lenz by name. The next morning, company representatives appeared at the editor's office with threats of lawsuits and withdrawal of advertising contracts. Within a day, the story vanished from circulation. Other journalists took note and fell silent. In Britain, the Distillers Company had its own network of influence. It offered generous donations to medical associations, sponsored lectures, and maintained close ties with government officials. When Dr. McBride's warning appeared in The Lancet, the press coverage that followed was cautious, buried deep inside the pages, framed as an ongoing debate. Editors preferred ambiguity to accusation. Even as the numbers of affected children grew impossible to ignore, most newspapers described the situation in Janie's bin to situation Janie's bin, euphemism, a sedative under review, an unexpected complication in certain pregnancies, a temporary misunderstanding. The language was sanitized, bloodless, carefully chosen to protect reputations. Mothers who had lost their infants or given birth to children with missing limbs read those phrases and felt the insult sharpen their grief. Television was no braver. In West Germany, the national broadcaster declined to show images of the children, calling them too distressing for viewers. A news anchor referred to the victims as unfortunate cases, as if misfortune were a natural phenomenon and not a product of human greed. The silence was not ignorance, it was management, a controlled, deliberate, quiet, designed to buy time. In hospital wards, however, time meant more suffering. The babies kept arriving, and the mothers kept asking questions the newspapers refused to print. Dr. Lenz and a handful of other physicians tried to feed information to sympathetic reporters under pseudonyms, but most editors killed the stories before they reached print. One journalist later wrote in his diary, "The truth is too large for the page and too costly for the printer." Still, the silence couldn't hold forever. Photographs began to circulate privately among medical professionals, black and white images of tiny bodies twisted by the drug. One reached the desk of a foreign correspondent in London who smuggled it into a story for a Sunday magazine. The editors hesitated, but finally printed it on the back page, a single column wide. The photograph was small, but it was enough. Readers wrote letters by the hundreds, demanding to know how such a thing could happen. And so, slowly, the silence in the papers began to crack. What had been a whisper in hospital corridors was about to become a roar that no lawyer could contain. But in those early months, before the outrage, the world remained suspended between knowing and pretending not to know. Ink dried on empty pages while the truth lay waiting in cribs, in hospitals, in the quiet breath of children who would never be anonymous again. While Europe stumbled through the aftermath of its own denial, across the Atlantic a quiet act of resistance had already saved a generation. In a small, cluttered office inside the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, a Canadian-born physician named Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of reports, laboratory data, and pharmaceutical dossiers. She was new to the FDA, still learning its bureaucracy. But when the application for a new sedative, Kevadon, the American trade name for thalidomide, landed on her desk in 1960, something in her training made her pause. The drug came with a promise, familiar to her: safe, non-addictive, free from side effects. The company, Richardson Merrill, wanted quick approval for distribution across the United States. They boasted that thalidomide had already conquered Europe, that millions of satisfied patients could not be wrong. Most reviewers would have rubber-stamped it. But Kelsey was not most reviewers. She had spent years studying pharmacology and the effects of drugs on fetal development. She knew how easily laboratory safety could disguise human danger. As she read through the company's submitted research, she saw the gaps immediately. No long-term data, no controlled studies on pregnant animals, no explanation for scattered reports of peripheral nerve damage in adult patients. The more she looked, the more questions surfaced. Why were the European clinical trials so brief? Why were adverse effects glossed over as transient? And why, she wondered, was the company so eager to rush her? When Kelsey requested further data, Richardson Merrill's executives grew impatient. They called her repeatedly, sent representatives to pressure her, even complained to her superiors. Each time, she refused to yield. "I cannot in good conscience recommend approval," she wrote in her memoranda. Her insistence infuriated the company, but she would not sign her name to uncertainty. Months passed. Outside her window, the headlines celebrated thalidomide's global success. Pregnant women in Canada and Europe praised its miracle cure for morning sickness. Richardson Merrill continued lobbying, insisting the drug was safe and demanding she stop delaying public benefit. Kelsey quietly held her ground. Then, in late 1961, the first reports from Germany and Australia reached her desk, telegrams from foreign doctors describing catastrophic birth defects linked to thalidomide, babies without limbs, hearts malformed. She felt the chill of vindication and horror at once. The disaster she had feared was real and already irreversible elsewhere. When the story finally broke internationally, the United States realized how narrowly it had escaped. Thousands of American women had received thalidomide samples during clinical testing, but because of Kelsey's refusal to grant full approval, the disaster never reached the same scale. Only a few dozen American infants were affected, a fraction of what might have been. In August 1962, President John F. Kennedy invited Kelsey to the White House. Standing beneath the soft lights of the East Room, she received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, one of the few women ever to do so. Kennedy praised her exceptional judgment and dedication to public health. The nation saw her as a hero, but she remained modest. "I was simply doing my job," she told reporters. Her vigilance, however, did more than save lives. It transformed American drug law. In the wake of thalidomide, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris amendments, requiring rigorous clinical trials, informed consent, and proof of safety before approval. No longer could a company claim safety through absence of death. While Europe wept and counted its losses, the United States learned through Kelsey's stubbornness that skepticism could be an act of mercy. She became a symbol of class. The conscience medicine had almost lost a reminder that science, unchallenged, can become its own blindness. The mothers she never met would never know her name, yet their children, born whole, would carry her legacy in every unscarred hand and every perfect heartbeat, proof that one quiet refusal can alter the course of history. When Kemi Grunenthal finally faced the courts in the late 1960s, the hall in Aachen was already heavy with ghosts. The benches overflowed with mothers in black coats, fathers gripping canes, children in wheelchairs whose hands and feet were small as bird bones. Journalists filled the aisles, their notebooks trembling with the weight of what they were about to record. For years, the company had denied responsibility, hiding behind scientific language and legal phrasing. But now, at last, the survivors were being given their day, or so they were told. The trial opened in December 1968, 7 years after the drug's withdrawal. By then, the world had moved on. Spacecraft orbited the moon, televisions glowed in every home, and a new generation of doctors promised safer science. But for the thalidomide families, time had not healed, it had hardened. Their children were growing, and with growth came new challenges. The need for prosthetics, surgeries, care, education. Every day was evidence of what had been stolen. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere oscillated between grief and exhaustion. The prosecution presented tens of thousands of pages of documents, internal memos, lab notes, safety reports quietly buried in archives. Each piece of paper revealed how much the company had known and how little it had done. Test animals had shown nerve damage. Warnings from doctors had arrived months before the recall. Still, Kemi Grunenthal had sold millions of doses. When executives were called to testify, they spoke in the language of bureaucracy. They expressed deep regret, but not guilt. "We could not have foreseen these outcomes," one insisted. "Our tests followed the standard of the time." They pointed to gaps in scientific knowledge, to the ignorance of the era, as though the lack of foresight excused the lack of conscience. Lawyers for the company called the catastrophe an unfortunate coincidence. The phrase rippled through the courtroom like a slap. Outside, protesters gathered daily. Mothers pushed wheelchairs through the snow, holding signs that read, "Our children are not coincidences." Survivors, many now school-age, faced cameras for the first time. Some smiled shyly, others looked away. Their presence was a living indictment more powerful than any legal argument. The trial dragged on for 2 years. Families traveled hundreds of miles to testify, only to sit in silence as technicalities consumed the proceedings. Judges debated admissibility, lawyers argued definitions. Every question of law seemed to stretch time further, until justice itself began to feel like another form of cruelty. Finally, in December 1970, the court declared the trial closed not with a verdict, but with a settlement. Kemi Grunenthal agreed to pay 100 million Deutsche Marks into a special compensation fund for German victims. In exchange, all criminal charges were dropped. Not one executive went to prison. Not one chemist lost his license. The official statement called it a fair and humane resolution. The mothers wept quietly in the corridors. Some took the settlement because they had no choice. Their children needed wheelchairs, surgeries, and tutors. Others refused the money in protest, calling it blood paid in installments. The newspapers hailed the agreement as closure, but the victims knew better. The payments were small and slow, the bureaucracy endless. In many countries, lawsuits dragged on for decades. In others, they never began. And so the thalidomide survivors learned that justice, like healing, is a process that never truly ends. The courtroom lights dimmed, the headlines faded, but the trials continued in the form of daily life. Every button fastened, every step taken on prosthetic limbs, every morning a parent lifted a growing child from bed, all became testimony. The court might have closed its books, but history had not. The evidence still breathed, still moved, still reached for a world that had tried to forget. They were not supposed to live, at least. That was what the early doctors said. Many of the infants born in the wake of thalidomide's devastation were so gravely deformed that survival itself seemed an act of defiance. But they did survive. Against the odds, against medical predictions, against the quiet wishes of some who thought their lives would be nothing but suffering, they grew, and in doing so, they became the living memory of a world's mistake. By the late 1960s, the thalidomide children had begun to fill schools, rehabilitation centers, and special institutions hastily built to accommodate them. In Germany, Britain, Japan, and Australia, entire wards were converted into training rooms. Physical therapists learned to adapt chairs, utensils, and desks for bodies that did not fit standard shapes. Some children learned to write with their feet. Others used their mouths to hold pencils. In photographs, they looked determined, fragile, yes, but fiercely alert, as though they knew, even then, that they were born to testify. Their parents faced a different kind of endurance. The joy that usually accompanied early milestones, a first step, a first word, was shadowed by dread. Each small victory required endless improvisation. How do you teach a child with no arms to feed themselves? How do you explain to them why the world stares? The mothers aged quickly, their faces lined with the effort of love that never rested. The fathers often grew silent, ashamed not of their children but of the world that had betrayed them. In Britain, support networks began to form. The Thalidomide Society was founded in 1962 by a handful of parents who refused to remain isolated. They met in church basements and borrowed halls, trading tips on prosthetics and legal letters. What started as quiet solidarity soon grew into activism. "We are not asking for charity," one father said. "We are demanding recognition." Across the Atlantic, advocacy groups echoed the same sentiment. As the children grew older, they began to define themselves not by what they lacked, but by what they could still do. Some painted, holding brushes between their toes. Others swam, balancing through water with the grace their bodies lacked on land. In classrooms, they learned to write essays about ethics and medicine, some of them more fluent in injustice than their teachers. Their existence forced society to confront the limits of pity, to see beyond deformity and into endurance. But their visibility came at a cost. The press, hungry for sensation, often photographed them like curiosities, the victims of science, the miracle survivors. Their faces appeared in magazines beside grim headlines and captions that reduced their lives to evidence. The children learned early that they were symbols before they were people. Still, they adapted. Their laughter returned, small but persistent. In homes across Europe, mothers fitted their children's prosthetic arms each morning as they packed lunches and tied scarves. The rhythm of life reasserted itself. It was never normal, but it was theirs. By the time the 1970s arrived, many of the survivors were entering adolescence. They wanted independence, education, and dignity, not pity. They began to speak publicly, their voices steady, their words sharp. "We are not broken," one young woman declared at a press conference. "We were betrayed." The children who survived grew into adults who refused to be erased. Their very presence became an indictment and a hope proof that life could endure even after science had failed it. And while the world tried to move on, these survivors carried the truth in every motion of their bodies. Every lifted cup, every signed letter, every step made without arms or legs was a quiet, continuous rebellion. A reminder that what had been done could never be undone, but neither could it be forgotten. By the early 1970s, the outrage that had simmered privately for years began to take written form. The parents, exhausted from doctors' visits, legal consultations, and broken promises, turned to the one thing they still had: their voices. And so the letters began. Thousands of them, written in cramped handwriting on lined stationery or typed on old machines, folded carefully into envelopes addressed to the men and women who governed their countries. Parliament House in London, the Bundestag in Bonn, the Diet in Tokyo, all began to receive the same cry in different languages. Please, listen to us. Many of the letters were not angry at first. They were pleading. Mothers described their children's conditions in heartbreaking detail, not for sympathy, but for recognition. "My daughter can hold a cup with her toes," one British woman wrote. "She can smile, though she cannot walk, but I cannot afford the special chair she needs. I ask you, what future will she have if the government refuses to see her?" Another mother in Germany wrote, "My son has no arms. He is 7. He wants to go to school. The teachers say they are not trained. Do I tell him he must stay home because science made a mistake?" The letters piled up by the hundreds. Clerks sorted them into folders labeled public concerns, medical compensation, and bureaucrats read them with polite detachment. Some were acknowledged with form letters, others ignored. "Your correspondence has been received," one reply read, "and will be reviewed by the appropriate department." But nothing moved. In Westminster, the debates were hesitant, cautious. Members of Parliament discussed thalidomide as if it were a technical inconvenience rather than a humanitarian crisis. The distillers' company, whose drug Distaval had poisoned thousands, continued to deny responsibility. Their lawyers argued that the drug had been approved under existing laws that no one could have known. Behind closed doors, politicians worried that forcing a settlement might scare other pharmaceutical investors from Britain. Profit and policy weighed heavier than compassion, but the letters kept coming, and with them, the tone began to change. Fathers, too, began to write terse, restrained, but trembling with quiet fury. "We fought a war to protect our children's future," one man wrote, "and now we are fighting our own government for their dignity." Others sent photographs, small, square prints of children smiling bravely beside prosthetic limbs. One note simply read, "This is my child, do not look away." In Germany, the same chorus rose. Parents gathered in Bonn carrying folders thick with correspondence and photographs, demanding to speak with health ministers who avoided their eyes. When they were turned away, they left the letters piled neatly on the steps of the Parliament building, hundreds of envelopes fluttering in the wind like small white flags of surrender. The few lawmakers who dared to champion the cause were ridiculed by colleagues for their emotional appeals. But some persisted. In Britain, Labour MP Jack Ashley, whose own daughter was born deaf, took up the thalidomide issue in Parliament. His voice shook with controlled anger as he read aloud the words of the parents. "We are not beggars, we are citizens, and our children are not mistakes." Slowly, the tide began to shift. The letters, once scattered, ignored, had formed a paper revolution. They built a bridge of grief between ordinary families and the chambers of power. Each page was a wound made visible, each envelope a small act of resistance. By the mid-1970s, politicians could no longer hide behind silence. The letters had done what courts and corporations refused to do. They forced acknowledgement. It was not yet justice, but it was a beginning proof that even in a world anesthetized by bureaucracy, the written word could still pierce the armor of indifference. For the thalidomide families, every letter sent was both a confession and a weapon, an insistence that what had been done to them would not be lost to history's polite forgetfulness. By the middle of the 1970s, the public could no longer look away. For nearly a decade, the thalidomide tragedy had been described in numbers in columns of statistics and cautious phrases like congenital malformation. But numbers do not bleed, and statistics do not smile. It was only when the photographs began to appear that the truth finally broke free from abstraction. The first images were printed hesitantly, buried inside medical journals and charity newsletters. Black and white, clinical, almost antiseptic, they showed children sitting upright with missing arms or legs, their faces calm but solemn, their bodies shaped by history's error. The photos were meant for scientific study, yet even doctors felt their pulse quicken when they turned the pages. The images were too human to stay confined within the borders of academia. Then came the newspapers. In 1972, the Sunday Times in London defied legal threats from the Distillers Company and published a series of investigative reports that changed everything. On its front pages, the world saw for the first time the faces of thalidomide. There were children in wheelchairs, smiling shyly, balancing crayons between toes, learning to feed themselves with mechanical arms. Their names were printed beneath the photographs: Alison, David, Susan, Paul. No longer faceless, they became mirrors held up to a society that had tried to turn away. The response was immediate and seismic. Readers wept, wrote letters, and demanded that the government act. "We cannot unsee this," one editorial declared. In living rooms across Britain, people stared at the images while stirring their tea in silence, realizing that the catastrophe they had vaguely heard of was not confined to headlines. It had faces, voices, laughter, and pain. In Germany, similar photographs began circulating in magazines. The children were older now, teenagers with bright eyes and sharp humor. They had learned to navigate life with prosthetic limbs, some even joking with the photographers as if to reclaim the act of being seen. But behind their courage was anger. They wanted justice, not pity. Their faces were not symbols of resilience, but reminders of betrayal. Chemie Grunenthal and the Distillers Company scrambled to control the damage. Their spokesman accused the press of exploiting private suffering. They threatened lawsuits against any publication that used unauthorized images. But the tide of public sympathy was stronger than corporate intimidation. The photos spread anyway, copied, reprinted, shown on television screens, carried on protest placards. Each image became a question that no one could answer. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had no one stopped it? What price could possibly compensate for a missing arm, for a lifetime of stares and surgeries? For the children themselves, the sudden visibility was a strange kind of liberation. They were no longer hidden behind curtains or whispered about as medical curiosities. They were, at last, acknowledged not as defects, but as survivors. Some of them began speaking to journalists directly, explaining their daily routines, their dreams, their frustrations. One young man in Britain, when asked what he wanted most, replied simply, "A future that isn't a story for anyone else's comfort." The photographs forced a reckoning that no courtroom verdict could deliver. They confronted the world with its own reflection, a civilization so eager for comfort and convenience that it had turned a blind eye to the cost. And yet, amidst the shock and sorrow, something new began to stir: resolve. The faces of thalidomide were no longer only victims, they were witnesses. They looked out from the newspapers not with accusation, but with endurance, daring the world to do better, to never again confuse progress with humanity. From that moment on, thalidomide was no longer a word buried in reports. It was a memory etched into human expression, a truth carried in the eyes of those who had every reason to look away, but didn't. The courthouse in Bonn smelled faintly of paper and rain the morning the first victims entered. It was 1973, more than a decade since the drugs recall, and now the surviving children were old enough to walk or roll into the room themselves. Some balanced on crutches, others maneuvered wheelchairs, or wore mechanical arms that clicked faintly in the silence. Their presence turned the trial from abstraction into flesh. The lawyers could no longer hide behind documents and charts. The evidence had faces, voices, and eyes that did not look away. The courtroom was crowded journalists with notepads, mothers clutching folders of medical reports, fathers sitting stiffly with jaws locked tight. At the front, beneath the stark light of justice's pretense, sat the representatives of Chemie Grunenthal, middle-aged men in tailored suits, their hair graying, their expressions carefully rehearsed. They bowed their heads when the children entered, but their eyes were dry. When proceedings began, the company's lawyer stood and spoke with practiced solemnity. He offered deep regret for the pain caused, but insisted that no crime had been committed. "We were guided," he said, "by the scientific knowledge available at the time. The tragedy that followed was unforeseeable." The words hung in the air like smoke, shapeless, evasive. One mother stood up in the gallery, trembling. "You didn't need more science," she cried. "You needed humanity." The judge rapped his gavel, asking for order, but the room was already burning with emotion. For the families, this was not just a trial. It was an exorcism of silence. Over the weeks that followed, witnesses took the stand: doctors, pharmacists, researchers, executives. The prosecutors read aloud internal company memos that revealed early warnings about nerve damage and toxicity. One letter, dated 1959, mentioned unusual results in animal tests. Another noted reports of paresthesia, numbness in fingers and toes in patients. Yet the company had dismissed these findings, branding them minor side effects. The defense countered with arguments of context. The standards of testing then were not what they are now, they repeated. To judge past actions by modern criteria is unfair. But fairness, to the parents, had long ago lost its meaning. During one session, the court heard testimony from a nurse who had worked in Grunenthal's pharmacology department. Her voice shook as she described how samples of Contagon were distributed freely to doctors and midwives, even as questions about safety lingered. "We were told it was harmless," she said. "We believed it because we wanted to believe." Her confession was not vindictive, only haunted. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, holding placards that read, "Justice for our children and science must answer." The media called it the courtroom of contrition. Though contrition was scarce, what unfolded inside was less repentance than performance, a delicate dance between legal responsibility and moral evasion. After months of testimony, the outcome followed the pattern history had already written. No one went to prison. The executives issued a final apology, scripted by lawyers. "We deeply regret the suffering caused and commit ourselves to support affected families." The court accepted a financial settlement, and the trial was declared closed. For the parents, it felt like a second betrayal. The compensation, when it finally arrived, was meager enough to buy prosthetics, not justice. Many tore up the checks or left them uncashed in drawers, reminders of a debt that could never truly be paid. Yet the courtroom left behind something the company could not erase. The testimony, recorded and archived, became the moral ledger of the tragedy the day the victims forced the world to listen, if only for a moment. As the families filed out into the drizzle, one father turned back toward the courthouse steps and whispered, "They may not have confessed, but they have been seen." And in that small truth in being seen there was, at last, the faintest echo of justice. He was an old man by the time the world began to whisper his name again, the chemist who had helped synthesize thalidomide. In his youth, he had been hailed as a man of promise, one of Germany's rising post-war scientists, eager to build rather than destroy. But now, as the 70s drew on, he lived quietly, retired from the company, his name fading from public memory. He did not give interviews, he did not attend the trials, and yet he carried the echoes of them everywhere he went. Each morning, he walked alone to the small laboratory he kept behind his house, a relic of his old life, lined with shelves of glass beakers and bottles still half filled with powders that had long lost their potency. The space smelled faintly of ethanol and dust, an alchemy of memory and regret. He would sit at the same wooden bench, hands folded, staring at the equipment that had once made him proud. The instruments gleamed faintly in the half-light, innocent as ever. In his mind, he returned to the early days, to Stolberg, to the excitement that had hummed through the factory halls in the 50s. They had believed they were saving people. They had dreamed of a sedative so safe that even a child could take it. There had been laughter in the corridors, toasts in the cafeteria, engineers discussing future expansions. He could still hear it, that clinking optimism, the sound of progress before it turned to ruin. He told himself, as he had told investigators years before, that he hadn't known, that no one could have predicted the effect the drug would have on unborn children. But deep inside, he remembered the reports that had crossed his desk, the odd animal reactions, the strange numbness in test subjects, the letters from doctors mentioning patient complaints. He had filed them away, trusting that someone else would look closer, someone else would ask the hard questions. It was easier not to. Now, in the silence of his old age, he could no longer hide behind the science. He would sit by his workbench with the radio playing softly, hearing the stories of thalidomide survivors demanding justice, their voices older now, but still sharp with pain. They are grown, he thought. Children no longer people living with what I helped make. Sometimes, in the late hours, he took down the small amber vial he had kept, the last remnant of the compound he had once believed in. He turned it between his fingers, watching the faint glimmer of the crystals within. How harmless they looked, how deceptively pure. He did not pray. He had stopped believing in prayer when he saw what certainty could do, but he would whisper, almost to the air, "We wanted to help." The words felt hollow, stripped of meaning by time. In the rare letters he received from former colleagues, the past was never mentioned. They wrote about the weather, about grandchildren, about the price of medicine. The silence between their lines was louder than confession. He died quietly a few years later, in his sleep, his notebooks still stacked neatly on his desk. The press called him a scientist of his time, as if time itself were a kind of absolution. But in that small laboratory, after the funeral, his wife found a single page torn from a notebook, one line written in his narrow, trembling script. The error was not in the molecule. It was in us. It was the closest he ever came to apology, a truth distilled at last, not in the lab, but in the loneliness of conscience. In the gleaming offices of Chemie Grunenthal, time seemed to move differently than it did in the homes of the victims. Outside, the world was still reckoning with the faces of thalidomide, the photographs, the protests, the documentaries that would not let the story rest. But inside the company's headquarters in Stolberg, the walls gleamed with fresh paint, the reception desk was polished, and the phones never stopped ringing. Business was good. New drugs were in development. The tragedy, they insisted, was behind them. The company's executives had mastered the language of absolution without ever speaking the word sorry. They referred to thalidomide as the incident, never the catastrophe. In their reports to shareholders, they emphasized the lessons learned, not the lives lost. When journalists requested interviews, they responded with press statements crafted by lawyers, full of words that sounded compassionate but meant nothing. Regret, sympathy, unfortunate, unforeseen. Money, not morality, became their measure of recovery. By the early 1970s, Grunenthal had returned to profit, while parents of thalidomide children were still raising funds for wheelchairs and surgeries. The company's laboratories were producing new anesthetics, antibiotics, and tranquilizers. Its name began to appear again in medical journals, not as a villain, but as a manufacturer of innovation. The industry welcomed them back without question. Science, it seemed, had no memory. When the German government established a compensation fund, Grunenthal contributed reluctantly, and only after protracted negotiation. Their lawyers insisted the payment did not constitute an admission of guilt. It was, they said, an act of goodwill. The figure, 100 million Deutsche Marks, was large enough to sound impressive, but small enough to preserve comfort. Divided among thousands of victims, it amounted to less than the cost of a Kate. new prosthetic limb per year. Meanwhile, the company's archives remained closed. Requests from journalists and historians were denied on grounds of privacy. Those who had once worked in the thalidomide division were quietly transferred or retired. Files vanished, replaced by sanitized annual reports that spoke of progress, expansion, global partnerships. The language of science had been replaced by the language of marketing. Every so often, reporters would appear at the gates of the factory, their cameras glinting under the Rhineland sun. Security guards would turn them away. Inside, the workers, many too young to remember the disaster, wore lab coats with the Grünenthal logo embroidered proudly above their hearts. To them, the past was a rumor, a story their elders avoided. The company's executives held annual dinners where toasts were made to the resilience of innovation. They spoke of the importance of trust between corporations and the public, as if they had not shattered that trust themselves. Some even took comfort in the idea that thalidomide had led to stricter safety laws. Out of tragedy came progress, one executive told a magazine. In a way, we helped the world. For the parents reading those words, it was salt on an open wound. The survivors called it what it was, profit built on ruin. To them, Grünenthal was not just a company. It was a monument to avoidance, a machine that had learned to speak in numbers instead of names. And yet, the machine kept turning, its lights glowing late into the night. The same walls that had once echoed with the optimism of discovery now whispered something colder, a truth the executives could never quite erase, that they had built their future upon the bodies of children who would never walk into one. The company survived, but its soul did not. It was, as one journalist later wrote, an empire of remorse without repentance, a factory that manufactured medicine while producing none for its own conscience. As the 1970s slipped into the next decade, the world's attention began to drift. The thalidomide scandal, once front-page news, became a paragraph in history books, a cautionary tale told briefly in medical ethics classes before being replaced by fresher headlines. In the great churn of modern life, wars, elections, discoveries, disasters, memory itself grew tired. And so, one by one, the nations that had once sworn never to forget began to do exactly that. In Germany, where the drug had first been born, the survivors were still fighting for fair compensation. Their government, uneasy with its own complicity, preferred quiet settlements over public acknowledgement. Officials spoke of healing, as though time alone could erase injustice. The word thalidomide disappeared from policy documents, replaced with euphemisms like pharmaceutical incident. Museums declined to display the photographs. The country that prided itself on facing its past drew a curtain over this one. In Britain, where the distiller's company had distributed the drug under the name Distaval, silence became bureaucracy. The compensation fund established after years of public pressure had been pitiful, its payments stretched across decades, indexed so poorly that inflation devoured their value. When survivors turned 21, many were told they no longer qualified for government assistance, as if adulthood cured deformity. The Ministry of Health shifted responsibility between committees until even the paperwork seemed to vanish into the fog of apathy. Across the sea, in Canada and Japan, the stories faded even faster. In both countries, victims' numbers were smaller, and so the grief was easier to ignore. A few local charities persisted, but their funding dwindled as donors turned to newer causes. In Brazil, where thalidomide had been used long after its European ban, the disaster was still unfolding. Poor women in remote regions continued to bear deformed children into the 1980s, never told the cause, never counted among the official victims. The world's conscience had moved on. Soothed by distance and denial, pharmaceutical companies launched new products, regulators wrote stricter laws, and politicians took credit for ensuring such a tragedy could never happen again. Yet the survivors still lived with its aftermath, every missing limb, every prosthetic strap, every ache of bone that rubbed against steel. They were living reminders of a history that governments preferred not to fund, not to photograph, not to teach. Some survivors tried to speak publicly, traveling to conferences and universities, telling their stories to young doctors and ethicists who listened with wide eyes and took notes as though studying mythology. "You must understand," one woman told a room of medical students in Oxford, "we are not history, we are the result of it." Her voice trembled, but her gaze did not. In Australia, a journalist who had covered the original scandal returned to interview families 20 years later. Many lived in the same houses, the same towns. He asked one father whether he still believed justice was possible. The man smiled sadly and said, "Justice? No. But memory, that's something we can still fight for." Yet even memory proved fragile. As survivors aged, as their parents died, archives were misplaced, lawsuits settled quietly, and media interest waned. By the end of the century, some nations no longer even listed thalidomide among their official medical disasters. The silence, it seemed, had returned, refined by time. But silence is never empty. Beneath it lies endurance. In Germany, Britain, and Japan, small survivor groups continued to meet in community halls and rented rooms. They brought photo albums, prosthetic repair kits, and coffee. They told stories that no one else wanted to hear, ensuring that what their countries forgot, they themselves would remember. Because forgetting is the final betrayal, and the thalidomide generation refused to disappear quietly into history's mercy. By the early 1980s, the children who had survived thalidomide were no longer children at all. They had grown into teenagers and young adults, carrying with them the weight of deformity, of public scrutiny, and of a world that had moved on while they were still defined by absence. Limbs missing, hands fused, legs shortened, their bodies told a story that no one could erase. Yet, in that physical limitation, they discovered something else. A voice. In towns across Britain, Germany, Australia, and Japan, the survivors began to organize. They met quietly at first, in church basements and community centers, sharing experiences that no one else could understand. Prosthetic adjustments, surgical histories, therapy routines, these practical concerns became the basis for discussion. But soon, anger threaded itself into conversation. They were angry at the companies that had sold the drug, at governments that had delayed justice, at the media that had turned their lives into spectacle. From whispered meetings came action. The first public demonstrations were small. A few dozen young people rolling or walking along city streets, holding signs reading, "We were not coincidences, and science must answer." Police looked on, confused but unconcerned. Passers-by stared. Some mothers watched from doorways, their faces a mixture of pride and fear. Then, in 1981, a coordinated demonstration took place in London. Hundreds of survivors gathered outside the headquarters of the pharmaceutical companies that had once distributed thalidomide. They carried banners, photographs, and letters written to politicians years before but ignored, now read aloud to the press. Their voices were steady, rhythmic, and defiant. For the first time, the public could not look away. Newspapers called it the Children's Revolt. Television crews filmed the protest, capturing the determination in bodies that had been minimized, ridiculed, or hidden for decades. Some young people had prosthetics that allowed them to write slogans on large sheets of cardboard. Others had fashioned mechanical arms to hold cameras, ensuring that their perspective would be seen. They were not passive victims. They were witnesses, activists, and historians of their own lives. The revolt forced governments to act. Parliamentary committees reconvened, slowly, haltingly, to review compensation schemes. In Germany, the fund that had been established in 1970 was re-evaluated. In Britain, promises of lifelong medical support were codified. The children, now adults, demanded not charity, but recognition. They wanted their suffering documented, their names remembered, their needs met. Their activism changed the public perception of thalidomide survivors. No longer were they merely subjects of pity or statistical footnotes in medical journals. They became advocates, leaders, and educators. Universities invited them to speak. Medical schools incorporated their stories into ethics curricula. They used their visibility to prevent future mistakes, to remind the world that the cost of oversight is human and that no bureaucracy can erase the consequences of negligence. Yet, even as governments and companies made concessions, the revolt was about more than compensation. It was about identity, about reclaiming their lives from a tragedy imposed before they could speak. Every wheelchair on the march, every prosthetic limb lifted to the sky, every determined stride was an assertion: we exist, we remember, we demand justice. By the end of the decade, the thalidomide generation had transformed grief into action. They had taken their silence, the years of quiet suffering, and made it raw. The world, finally, had no choice but to listen. And in the streets, in the community halls, in the newspapers and on television, their revolt became permanent, a living monument to endurance, defiance, and the power of those who had once been forgotten. In the aftermath of the children's revolt, governments scrambled to contain both public outrage and moral responsibility. In Germany, the federal government announced the creation of a compensation fund, a measure intended to provide for the thalidomide survivors. On paper, it seemed a monumental gesture. 100 million Deutsche Marks set aside to assist thousands of victims. A recognition, finally, of a catastrophe that had spanned continents and decades. But the reality was far harsher. Bureaucrats tasked with administering the fund moved slowly, weighed down by rules, eligibility criteria, and ever-changing definitions of affected individuals. Every form required multiple signatures. Every claim demanded proof of ingestion and documentation that many families, especially in rural areas, could not provide. Receipts from old pharmacies were long lost. Letters from doctors had been discarded. For the families, navigating the paperwork became almost as arduous as raising a child born without limbs. The compensation itself was paltry. Payments were calculated per child, but with caps on annual amounts and restrictions on how the money could be used. Prosthetic limbs, surgeries, specialized schools, therapy, the costs far exceeded the disbursements. Parents were forced to stretch the funds, often turning to charities or community support to supplement what the state provided. Some families refused the payments outright, calling them insulting. One father in Hamburg famously tore up his first check, declaring to reporters, "No money can replace what was stolen from my daughter." In Britain, the situation was similar. The Distillers Company, bound by legal agreements and the pressure of public scrutiny, contributed to a national fund. But their contribution was only a fraction of the estimated need, and administration was fragmented across multiple local authorities. Each application felt like an interrogation. Families were required to prove their children's disabilities in exacting medical terms, even as they dealt daily with the visible consequences of the drug. Every missing limb was weighed against bureaucratic definitions of eligibility. Every malformed hand compared to the rigid tables of a government manual. Australia and Japan also established compensation mechanisms, though inconsistently. In some regions, survivors waited years to receive even token sums. In others, administrative errors meant payments were delayed or denied entirely. Many families learned to navigate the system only through networks of other survivors, exchanging advice, contacts, and forms. The fund, meant as an apology, became a second struggle, a grinding bureaucracy layered atop grief. Yet the Broken Promises Fund did offer one undeniable outcome: visibility. It forced governments to acknowledge the existence of thalidomide's victims. Clinics and social services were compelled to track survivors, their conditions, and their needs. Prosthetic technology improved, medical professionals specialized in rehabilitation, and educational programs adapted. The fund became a focal point around which advocacy groups could rally, pressuring legislators to maintain attention on the survivors' needs. Still, the moral weight of the tragedy remained unquantifiable. No check, no procedure, no form could restore what had been stolen. the limbs, the innocence, the years lost to surgeries, therapy, and social exclusion. Families lived with the reminder of corporate negligence every day. The paperwork, a small but constant echo of a larger betrayal. By the mid-1970s, the Broken Promises Fund was in full operation. It provided aid, yes, but it also served as a reminder. Even when governments acted, their gestures were constrained, measured, and inadequate. Justice, in this case, was procedural. Humanity, as ever, demanded more. And so the survivors' children of thalidomide, who were now young adults, learned to navigate both worlds, the tangible reality of their disabilities and the intangible bureaucracy of compensation. The fund could not erase the past, but it became a tool, flawed though it was, to demand that society finally pay attention. It was, as one mother said quietly in a meeting with social workers, a small lifeline in a sea of promises broken. The world had believed thalidomide to be a cautionary tale, a dark scar of the mid-20th century, a drug that promised comfort but delivered catastrophe, and for decades it remained banned, spoken of in hushed tones, a lesson in medical ethics, regulatory failure, and human greed. Yet the story did not end there. By the late 1980s, a strange, unsettling resurrection began to unfold. A return not to Europe, not to its first victims, but to the far-reaching laboratories of modern medicine, where science, necessity, and desperation intersected. Researchers discovered that thalidomide, despite its history, had properties that could not be ignored. In particular, it demonstrated remarkable anti-inflammatory effects. Initially, the studies were small and cautious, lab cultures, animal models, isolated cases. But the results were undeniable. The drug appeared capable of reducing the severe inflammation caused by leprosy, a disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. For patients who suffered from the nerve pain, skin lesions, and progressive disability of Hansen's disease, thalidomide offered relief where nothing else had. Clinical trials began, this time under strict regulatory oversight. Scientists were meticulous. Informed consent was required, dosages carefully monitored, and women of childbearing age excluded from participation. The shadow of history hung over every procedure. Every vial, every note, every photograph was scrutinized to prevent the mistakes of the past. The drug was no longer a miracle to be taken lightly. It was a tool wielded with caution and fear. By the early 1990s, the drug had found additional uses. It demonstrated promise in treating certain cancers, particularly multiple myeloma. Doctors were astonished. A molecule that had once devastated unborn generations now offered hope for those whose lives were already in peril. Yet every prescription carried a stark warning. This was a drug with a past that could not be erased, a chemical legacy of horror. Pregnant women were barred, contraception strictly enforced, and educational programs implemented to ensure absolute awareness of its risks. Pharmaceutical companies marketed the drug under new names, often deliberately avoiding its original association with Europe's tragedy. Yet the stories of the survivors remained ever present in the minds of regulators. Any slip in procedure, any miscommunication, could recreate history on a smaller scale. The regulatory frameworks, built in the wake of thalidomide, the Kefauver-Harris amendments in the US, the German safety protocols. International ethical guidelines were constantly tested by its return. Patients who received thalidomide now understood its history. For many, the knowledge was chilling. Relief from disease came with the weight of memory. Doctors frequently recounted its past to patients and families, not merely as information but as moral instruction, a reminder of what happens when science is unchecked, when oversight fails, and when profit precedes precaution. And yet, despite its history, thalidomide saved lives. Its return forced the medical world to confront a difficult paradox. A drug that had caused unimaginable suffering could also alleviate it. It was proof that chemicals are neutral. It is humanity that corrupts or redeems. The survivors of the original tragedy watched from afar, some angered, some wary, some understanding the complexities. Their lived experience remained unique and unreplicable, but the resurrection of the pill reminded the world that lessons are never simple, and that vigilance must always accompany innovation. Thalidomide had returned not as a savior, not as a villain, but as a cautionary emblem, a chemical with memory, history embedded in every molecule, whispering insistently to those who would dare handle it, "Do not forget." By the mid-1990s, the name thalidomide had resurfaced, not as a scandal alone, but as a case study in ethics, regulation, and human fallibility. Across medical schools, universities, and bioethics conferences, professors cited the drug as the cautionary tale of the century, a reminder that science, however brilliant, could become blind if divorced from morality. Yet even with decades of study, the lessons remained incomplete, half-learned, and often ignored. In classrooms from Boston to Berlin, students pored over photographs of infants with malformed limbs, poring over clinical reports and government documents. They debated the failures, corporate negligence, regulatory oversights, and the moral compromises of scientists chasing prestige or profit. They were taught to ask the questions that were never asked in the 1950s. Who benefits from a drug? Who bears its risk? And yet, outside the lecture halls, the systems that had allowed the disaster to unfold remained, prone to repetition. By the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies were booming. New drugs were being developed faster than regulators could examine them. Clinical trials, though more rigorous than before, were still subject to influence, pressure, and expedience. The thalidomide legacy, the strict protocols, the insistence on rigorous fetal safety studies had become codified law, yet loopholes and lapses still emerged. Even with modern science, the tension between profit and caution persisted, echoing the same failures that had once devastated thousands of families. The survivors of the original thalidomide tragedy watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Many had fought tirelessly to secure compensation, healthcare, and recognition for decades, yet the systemic failures that had allowed the drug to spread remained embedded in global pharmaceutical culture. Some survivors turned to activism, lecturing to regulators, attending congressional hearings, or participating in public forums. They demanded vigilance, but often encountered institutional inertia. The world had seen the consequences once, yet, as always, time dulled memory. Even governments struggled to internalize the lessons fully. Reports published by health ministries acknowledged the history of thalidomide, but often couched recommendations in cautious language, emphasizing procedures without truly confronting the cultural complacency that had enabled the disaster. Policies improved incrementally. Fetal protection programs, stricter consent forms, reporting requirements, but they could not undo decades of neglect, nor could they fully prevent human error or corporate deception. Ethicists often argued that the thalidomide case should be remembered not only as a pharmaceutical failure, but as a moral test. It asked uncomfortable questions. Can progress exist without accountability? Can the pursuit of profit ever align with the preservation of human life? The discussions were thorough, rich, and emotional, yet the translation of theory into daily practice remained incomplete. Across labs, hospitals, and corporate offices, human ambition continued to collide with vulnerability. The chemical itself, thalidomide, had returned to the market in limited, tightly regulated forms for diseases like leprosy and multiple myeloma. Each prescription was a reminder that science carries dualities. The same molecule that had destroyed could also heal. And yet, even with safeguards, the specter of the past lingered. Regulators insisted on consent forms, warnings, and monitoring, but no system could erase memory or guarantee perfection. By the end of the century, one truth remained undeniable. Thalidomide's lesson had been internalized partially, technically, but never completely. Society had learned the protocols, the safety measures, the ethical debates, but the vigilance required to prevent repetition had to be continually renewed. History could inform, but it could not enforce. And so, Decades after the first white tablets rolled off the production line, thalidomide continued to whisper its warning. The line between miracle and catastrophe is perilously thin, and half-learned lessons are invitations for disaster to return. By the early years of the 21st century, the survivors of thalidomide were no longer children, nor even adolescents struggling to navigate the complications of prosthetics and therapy. They were adults, some middle-aged, some approaching the later decades of life, carrying the legacy of a catastrophe that had shaped their bodies, their minds, and the way the world saw them. Yet with adulthood came agency, independence, and a renewed determination to define themselves beyond the labels of victims. Many had forged careers despite their limitations. Some became artists, using their unique perspectives to capture the world with creativity born of adaptation. Others became engineers, therapists, or advocates, channeling the lessons of their upbringing into professions that demanded precision, empathy, and resilience. Their bodies shaped by deformity had taught them ingenuity from birth. Every challenge overcome, every prosthetic mastered, every step taken without assistance became a quiet declaration of autonomy. Families had aged with them, their parents often having borne the brunt of both grief and bureaucracy. By now, many of the original mothers and fathers had passed, leaving the survivors to navigate not only the physical consequences of thalidomide, but also the social and legal landscapes it had reshaped. Support networks, advocacy groups, and survivor organizations had become crucial. They provided advice on prosthetic maintenance, medical interventions, and the ongoing legal battles that never truly ended. The communities that had formed in the 1970s now acted as living archives, memory keepers of both tragedy and resilience. Education had always been a battlefield. Schools in the 1960s and 1970s had struggled to accommodate the children, often segregating them or labeling them as limited. By the 2000s, inclusive policies had transformed access to education, but the survivors remembered the stigma. Many had fought for modifications, tutoring, and accessible classrooms, and some had gone on to become educators themselves, ensuring that future generations learned from their experiences. Their presence in the professional world challenged perceptions, proving that physical difference did not equate to incapacity. Yet the psychological legacy was complex. Survivors lived with the awareness that their conditions had been preventable, imposed not by nature, but by human negligence. Many reported a mixture of anger, grief, and defiance. Therapy and counseling had become integral in adulthood, helping them process the emotional weight of a life forever altered by a single chemical compound. Advocacy became their shared language. Survivors spoke at universities, medical schools, and conferences, telling their stories not for pity, but as warnings. They emphasized the importance of ethics, rigorous testing, and transparency in pharmaceutical development. Governments and regulatory bodies increasingly consulted them for guidance on clinical trials, safety measures, and consent procedures. Their voices, once silenced, had become authoritative. Internationally, their experiences shaped policy. The lessons of thalidomide informed global protocols on drug safety, consent, and risk management. And yet, the survivors themselves remained the most vivid reminder of what occurs when human oversight fails. Each scar, each prosthetic, each adaptive technique testified to resilience born of necessity. By the 21st century, the children of thalidomide, now adults, carried their legacy into every aspect of life: professional, social, and personal. They had transformed trauma into activism, limitation into ingenuity, and silence into testimony. They were living archives, proof of both the cost of negligence and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And in every step they took, every hand they used, every eye that saw the world differently they tender, reminded humanity that survival alone is not enough. Acknowledgement, justice, and remembrance are the true measures of endurance. In a small, dimly lit office tucked beneath the spires of the German archives, a single wooden box sat on a metal shelf. It was unremarkable to any passerby, a plain rectangle of polished oak, locked with a simple brass latch. Yet within that box lay the remnants of a tragedy that had spanned continents and decades. Letters, photographs, memos, and reports, thousands of pages chronicling what had once been called Contagan, then Distaval, then thalidomide, all carefully stacked, yellowed with age, the edges fraying like the patience of those who had endured it. The archivist who maintained the collection treated the contents with reverence. Each document was catalogued meticulously, its provenance noted, its significance weighed. He understood that the box was more than paper. It was a repository of human consequence. He handled the pages with gloves, aware that every crease, every annotation, every marginal note told a story of lives altered, of promises broken, of silence maintained too long. Inside were the letters from mothers to hospitals and government ministries, written in trembling cursive or typewritten on fragile sheets. They spoke plainly of children born without limbs, of families struggling to survive, of letters ignored or misfiled, of a world that had looked away. There were photographs, initially intended for medical study, now haunting. Infants in incubators, their bodies strange yet unmistakably human. Their eyes stared into the lens, as if seeking recognition from the future. Among the documents were the internal memos of Chemie Grunenthal, reports that had been meant to remain confidential. They described early warnings, anomalous animal tests, reports of peripheral nerve damage, concerns raised by physicians. Some were marked with red ink, "Do not disclose." Others simply folded and filed, forgotten until the archivist rediscovered them decades later. The box also held correspondence from international pharmaceutical centers, regulators, some cautious, some complicit, others alarmed but powerless to act. The archivist often paused while reading, aware that the box was a silent courtroom. He could hear the echoes of voices long gone, the mothers who had begged for attention, the doctors who had tried and failed to warn, the corporate executives who had issued carefully measured reassurances. Each page was testimony, each envelope a witness. Occasionally, scholars or journalists were allowed access, supervised under strict conditions. They would open the box with trembling hands, flipping through decades of human suffering. They read letters from Australia, Japan, and Britain alongside those from Germany, tracing the global reach of the catastrophe. The box became a bridge across time and space, a repository of evidence and memory, yet the archivist knew that most people would never see it. The box existed for those willing to confront what history often tries to hide. It was not a museum artifact or a SPID relic. It was an indictment. Every document contained moral weight, a reminder of what occurs when profit, bureaucracy, and negligence outweigh humanity. And so, behind locked doors, the box waited, waiting for researchers, for historians, for families seeking answers, waiting to speak in silence, to remind a world too eager to forget that the tragedy of thalidomide was not merely a chapter in a textbook, but a lived reality encoded in ink, photographs, and fragile paper. For the archivist, opening the box was never routine. Each time it was a confrontation with history itself, the scale of suffering, the breadth of denial, and the enduring need to remember. And in remembering, perhaps, the world could honor the lives it had once overlooked. By the late 20th century, the reverberations of the thalidomide tragedy had extended far beyond medicine, beyond law, and into the realm of ethics itself. The world had witnessed the consequences of a chemical unleashed without foresight, and the aftermath had reshaped the very way science approached responsibility. What had begun as a cautionary tale had become a cornerstone of bioethics, a subject of study in classrooms, conference halls, and international treaties. In medical schools, students learned about thalidomide not merely as a pharmaceutical failure, but as a moral imperative. Professors emphasized the ethical questions it raised. Who bears responsibility for unintended harm? How should human lives be weighed against corporate ambition? At what point does innovation demand restraint? Case studies replaced lectures on theory. Photographs of children with malformed limbs accompanied discussions about informed consent, patient autonomy, and corporate accountability. The words, "do no harm," took on a weight previously unimaginable. Pharmaceutical companies, now operating in an era of heightened scrutiny, had to adapt. Every new drug required extensive preclinical trials, with particular attention to teratogenic effects, the potential for fetal deformity. Regulatory agencies demanded double-blind studies, peer-reviewed publications, and comprehensive documentation. Pregnant women were excluded from initial trials. Informed consent forms were standardized, explicit, and legally binding. For the first time, ethics committees had real authority, capable of halting research if human risk exceeded acceptable thresholds. Yet, even with these safeguards, the lessons were only partially internalized. Thalidomide's return in controlled use for leprosy and cancer had exposed the persistent tension between potential benefit and possible harm. Regulators and scientists continually faced the same moral dilemma: how to weigh the lives improved against the calm risk of catastrophic outcomes. The ethical frameworks forged in the wake of the 1960s were applied rigorously, but they required constant vigilance. A lapse in oversight, even small, could still have consequences reminiscent of history. Bioethicists often cited thalidomide as an example of the systemic failures that occur when trust is assumed rather than earned. The case emphasized transparency, the necessity of questioning authority, and the moral imperative to listen to those whose voices are marginalized. For decades, survivors themselves participated in conferences and panels, sharing their experiences not merely as testimony, but as ethical guidance. They became living instructors, embodying the stakes of failure. Legislation changed, too. International agreements codified the necessity of ethical review boards for clinical trials. In the United States, the Kefauver-Harris amendments had already strengthened the FDA, but by the 1990s, similar frameworks were implemented worldwide. Every nation seeking to approve a new drug had to demonstrate not only scientific evidence, but ethical responsibility. Pharmaceutical innovation was no longer purely a question of chemistry. It was inseparable from conscience. Yet, despite these reforms, ethicists cautioned that thalidomide's lessons were incomplete. Oversight could falter, regulations could be skirted, and human ambition could once again eclipse moral responsibility. The tragedy had forged new standards, yes, but the vigilance demanded by history could never be institutionalized fully. It required constant engagement, reflection, and the willingness to challenge authority. In this sense, thalidomide had done what it could never do in life. It had reshaped the conscience of medicine. The pill had destroyed, but its legacy had rebuilt, leaving a blueprint not just for safer drugs, but for an enduring conversation about ethics itself. And in every boardroom, lab, and classroom, the ghosts of those children lingered, ensuring that no decision would ever again be taken lightly. For the mothers of thalidomide, memory was not a passive thing. It was a constant companion, woven into the rhythm of daily life, a shadow that followed them long after the headlines faded and the courtroom lights dimmed. Decades after the first devastating births, they carried not only the weight of grief but the responsibility of remembrance. Every appointment, every surgery, every prosthetic fitting was a reminder of the world's failure and a testament to their endurance. In the mornings, mothers would wake before dawn, moving quietly through homes that smelled of antiseptic, polish, and laundry. Their children, now adults in many cases, or still navigating adolescence with missing limbs, slept in adapted beds or specialized cribs. Mothers checked the prosthetics, adjusted straps, replaced worn padding, and sometimes traced fingers along the outlines of tiny limbs that had never formed. These acts were routine, mechanical even, but each carried an emotional weight that could not be measured. The memory of early mornings, when first births were accompanied by stunned silence and whispered apologies from nurses, remained vivid. Mothers remembered the first time they held a child and realized that the hands they cradled were incomplete, that the arms they had imagined wrapping around them were absent. They remembered the futile conversations with doctors, the gentle lies meant to shield them from despair, and the relentless bureaucratic letters that promised aid while delaying it. In the quiet of the night, many mothers would write letters that were never sent. They documented each surgery, each therapy session, each milestone achieved with prosthetics or ingenuity. Some kept scrapbooks of photographs, carefully catalogued with dates and notes about progress, setbacks, and small victories. These were not meant for public consumption. They were testaments to survival, proof that despite what had been taken, their children had grown, adapted, and endured. Support networks became crucial. Mothers found solace in shared grief, in community halls where the only people who truly understood were others who had lived through the same horror. They exchanged practical advice, which prosthetic technicians were reliable, which therapists were compassionate, which schools accommodated children's needs. But beyond advice was a shared commitment to memory. Each story told, each letter read aloud, became a living archive of the lives that had been changed, the lives that had been nearly lost. Anniversaries were especially difficult. On the dates when children had been born, mothers would often place small tokens on mantles or at grave sites: flowers, a folded card, a worn blanket. These acts were private, intimate, and deliberate. They were not only mourning, but a promise to remember, to honor, to bear witness. For some, these moments were accompanied by silence. For others, by tears that had been held back for decades. The memory of mothers extended beyond their own children. They became advocates, speaking publicly, participating in survivor organizations, lobbying for international awareness. They understood that forgetting would be complicity. Their persistence ensured that future generations of scientists, doctors, and regulators would learn from the mistakes of the past. Even as they aged, the mothers' memories remained vivid. They recalled the first headlines, the quiet hospital corridors, the small white tablets that had caused so much, and though time dulled the edge of sorrow, it could not erase the lessons, the vigilance, or the love that had carried them through every decade. For the children of thalidomide, these memories were both a lifeline and a burden. They were proof of care, of advocacy, of endless devotion. And for the mothers, they were a daily reminder. The world had failed, but their memory would endure, a quiet, unyielding testament to loss, resilience, and the unbroken bond between parent and child. Each year, on the date when Contagon was first withdrawn from German pharmacies, a quiet, almost imperceptible ritual unfolded. Mothers, fathers, and survivors of thalidomide gathered in small, unassuming spaces, community halls, church basements, and sometimes cemeteries, to remember what the world had once tried to forget. It was not a celebration, nor was it a protest. It was a pause in time, a collective inhalation of grief and remembrance, a recognition of lives irrevocably altered by negligence, profit, and silence. The anniversary was marked differently in every country, but the tone remained consistent. In Germany, families laid small bouquets of white flowers on the steps of hospitals where the first cases had been documented. In Britain, survivors and parents met in quiet groups, reading letters that had been ignored for decades, each word resonating with the weight of history. In Australia and Japan, tiny memorials were erected, plaques that did not name the company nor the country, but simply acknowledged the children whose limbs, lives, and futures had been stolen. For the survivors, the day was both painful and necessary. They walked through streets that seemed unchanged, yet everything carried memory. The pharmacies that once sold the pill, the quiet hospital wards, the homes where parents had learned to improvise every task of daily life. The anniversary reminded them that the world had once turned away, and that the cost of silence was human. Every missing arm, every fused hand, every lifelong complication was a monument of absence, a testament that silence had consequences. In the ceremonies, mothers often spoke first. They read letters they had written in the 1960s, letters that had never reached their intended recipients or had been ignored when they did. Fathers recounted the slow march through bureaucracy, the endless legal delays, the compensation that had arrived years too late, too little. And then the survivors, grown now, spoke. Their words were measured, unflinching, and resolute. They described their lives, the challenges of education, employment, mobility, and social perception. They shared their anger, their resilience, and their demand that history remember. Journalists sometimes attended these gatherings, capturing images of quiet reflection, the subtle interactions between generations. A mother would adjust a prosthetic arm on a child turned adult. A father would clasp the hand of a survivor in solidarity, the group often holding a moment of silence for those who had died in infancy or early childhood. The world outside barely noticed. Most news outlets treated it as a local human interest story, failing to convey the depth of decades-long injustice. Yet for those present, the act of gathering, of speaking, and of remembering was its own form of accountability. Even the language of the anniversary carried weight. It was never called a celebration. It was called the Day of Memory, the Vigil of Silence, or the Commemoration of the Unseen. Each name was deliberate, a reminder that while the public and corporate conscience had attempted to erase the tragedy, those who lived it would never allow it to fade. The anniversary also served a subtle, ongoing warning to the world of medicine and governance. Vigilance is not a one-time obligation. Regulations, ethics, and oversight must be constantly enforced, for human ambition, indifference, and greed are always ready to exploit silence. The thalidomide tragedy was not merely historical, it was perennial, a shadow that could return if society allowed forgetfulness to prevail. By the end of the day, as families dispersed and the flowers wilted in the winter air, a quiet understanding persisted among those who remained. The silence had been broken, not by governments or corporations, but by memory itself. And memory, once awakened, could never again be entirely hushed. Decades after the first warnings were ignored, after the trials, after the compensation funds, after the public outrage faded and the world returned to its routines, one question persisted quietly, relentlessly, like a pulse beneath the surface of memory. How many more miracles will demand the same sacrifice? For survivors and families, the question was not hypothetical. It was etched into the rhythm of daily life, embedded in prosthetics, surgeries, therapy schedules, and the adaptations required to navigate a world built for unbroken bodies. It emerged in the cautious glances at new drugs, in the skepticism that lingered whenever a physician offered reassurance, in the quiet insistence that procedures be double-checked and trials rigorously monitored. Each new pill, each innovation, carried the ghost of thalidomide, a whisper that comfort and catastrophe could be inseparable. Ethicists, historians, and medical professionals debated the question in conferences and journals long after public attention had shifted. They examined risk assessment models, pharmacology data, and clinical trial methodologies. Yet the fundamental dilemma remained: how do we weigh human benefit against human vulnerability? How do we calculate the cost of oversight against the value of progress? Every innovation bore within it the potential for both salvation and harm, and thalidomide's shadow reminded the world that the line between the two was perilously thin. In families, the question took a more intimate form. Parents asked it to themselves in the quiet hours: had they done everything they could to protect their children? Had the systems they trusted failed them at every level? Even in moments of pride, when a child learned to walk, to write, to navigate a world without hands, the question lingered: what would have been different if someone had listened sooner, if regulators had acted faster, if corporate conscience had outweighed ambition? For the children, themselves, now adults, the question manifested as vigilance. They studied medicine, law, policy, and ethics. They became advocates and educators, not only for their own generation, but for those who might be subjected to similar mistakes in the future. Each lecture, each public appearance, each engagement with regulatory bodies was an act of insistence that the world not forget. Their bodies were living testimony. Their advocacy was the armor that history demanded. Yet even with awareness and activism, the question could not be answered definitively. New drugs entered the market daily. Pharmaceutical companies operated in complex international systems. Regulators faced pressure to approve treatments rapidly, and every time a miracle drug promised relief, there was a potential for repetition, a silent, invisible hazard, waiting for oversight to falter. The question was also moral. Could the world ever reconcile the advancement of medicine with the responsibility it demanded? Could it honor the memory of those lost and affected while continuing to innovate, to experiment, to heal? Thalidomide had taught the answer was never simple. Lessons had been learned, yes, but human ambition, curiosity, and error could never be entirely constrained. And so the question endures. In classrooms, boardrooms, hospitals, and living rooms, it waits patient, persistent, unavoidable. How many more miracles will demand the same sacrifice? It is not rhetorical. It is a challenge, a warning, and a call to conscience. In every new prescription, in every approval, in every decision, it whispers, vigilance is eternal. Memory is non-negotiable. And the price of complacency is always paid in human lives. For the survivors of thalidomide and the families who endured its consequences, the question remains unanswered, and the responsibility to ask it, to demand accountability, and to insist on remembrance, continues every single day. It began as a promise, a small white tablet, smooth and unassuming, wrapped in foil, placed gently on a mother's palm. Its name, thalidomide, contagon, distaval, tensival, whispered assurance. Sleep without danger, relief without consequence. It was a miracle of post-war science, a chemical solution to the age-old burdens of nausea, anxiety, and sleepless nights. Mothers trusted it, doctors prescribed it, pharmacies dispensed it, and the world believed in it. Yet within that unassuming pill lay the power to reshape humanity. It was invisible, colorless, and easy to swallow, yet its reach extended into the earliest stages of life, into the fragile architecture of forming limbs, hearts, and eyes. In countless wombs, it disrupted growth, rewrote biology, and etched a legacy of absence. Limbs that should have curled in infancy never formed. Fingers fused, eyes failed, hearts faltered. Lives once imagined in fullness were irreversibly altered. The weight of that white tablet was more than physical. It carried the authority of science, the trust of families, and the sheen of corporate credibility. Its consequences were multiplied by silence. The silence of pharmaceutical executives, the hesitation of regulators, the disbelief of physicians who refused to see patterns until the evidence was overwhelming. The tablet, though small, bore the burden of human oversight, the failure of ethics, and the fragility of trust. Decades later, the survivors, the children who lived, those who endured surgeries, prosthetics, and lifelong adaptation, walked through a world still grappling with the tablet's legacy. They carried the weight of what it had taken: missed limbs, altered bodies, lifelong vigilance. They also carried the memory of the mothers who had trusted the promises, of fathers who had tried to shield them, of siblings and communities forever changed. The tablet's influence had rippled far beyond the womb, shaping families, policies, and conscience itself. Governments had created compensation funds, courts had ruled, settlements had been paid, and pharmaceutical companies had issued apologies, carefully worded, legally neutral. But no amount of money could balance the scales. No apology could restore what was taken. And yet the tablet's story became a cornerstone of medical ethics, a cautionary tale for regulators, researchers, and clinicians. It taught that even well-intentioned science could become catastrophe if guided by ambition rather than conscience. Even today, the chemical itself continues to exist, controlled, studied, and used carefully for leprosy and multiple myeloma. In every clinical trial, in every prescription, the specter of its past looms. The same molecule that once destroyed lives now saves them, but never without remembrance, never without warning. Its duality embodies the paradox of human progress, creation and destruction, promise and peril, innovation and oversight. The weight of the white tablet is also moral. It is a reminder that trust is fragile, that oversight is vital, and that negligence has consequences that reverberate across generations. It is a symbol of human fallibility and a call to vigilance. It reminds the world that miracles, when misunderstood or mismanaged, can become instruments of tragedy. In the quiet of a hospital, a laboratory, or a home, the tablet's legacy endures. Each prosthetic limb, each therapy session, each advocacy meeting is a testament to survival, and yet the tablet remains a cautionary monument, a chemical that altered history, reshaped ethics, and left a mark that no apology, settlement, or law could ever fully erase. It began as a promise. It became a lesson. It remains a weight carried by every survivor, every family, and every society that dares to advance without remembering the cost.